My son-in-law did not know I owned the company he currently works for as CEO. He always saw me living a simple, quiet life. One day he invited me to an expensive dinner with his parents. I wanted to see exactly how they would treat a poor man. The answer arrived when his mother slid a thick envelope across the table. 5 minutes later, the illusion shattered forever. My name is Emmanuel Palmer. I am 69 years old, and what happened that fateful night forced me to tear down the empire I had quietly handed to the man who was systematically destroying my daughter. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to firmly stand up to arrogant people who underestimated your true worth based solely on the old clothes on your back. The maitre d' at the exclusive French restaurant looked at my faded corduroy jacket as if I had dragged mud across his pristine carpets. The dim lighting was designed to cast a flattering glow on the elite patrons. I walked past tables of silk suits and diamond necklaces, feeling the heavy weight of their collective stares. I did not care about their judgments. I only cared about the invitation from my son-in-law, Blake Stanford, and his parents. When I reached their table in the VIP corner, the atmosphere dropped to freezing. Gregory Stanford stared at me with contempt, his jaw clenched. His wife, Cynthia, let out an audible scoff, refusing to offer a greeting. Blake sighed heavily, pulling back his sleeve to check his silver Rolex with profound irritation, silently communicating that my presence was an unbearable inconvenience. And then there was my daughter. Alicia sat frozen next to Blake. Her brown eyes were cast downward, glued to the geometric patterns of the marble tabletop. She did not look up when I pulled out my chair. The brilliant, fiery African-American girl I had raised with so much pride had been replaced by a shrinking shadow. I took my seat, keeping my posture straight, waiting for the charade to begin. Nobody offered me a menu. Blake gestured to the waiter to pour spring water, ignoring my gaze. Gregory leaned back into his leather chair, crossing his arms in a hostile posture. Cynthia took a sip of her sparkling water before leaning forward. She bypassed pleasantries entirely, launching into a rehearsed speech about the boundaries of high society. She spoke extensively about elite social circles, corporate reputation, and the nature of high society investments. She used words like pedigree refinement and aesthetic harmony. What she meant was that I did not belong. I sat quietly, absorbing the venom dripping from her lips. She finally arrived at the main point of this dinner. Blake was hosting a corporate anniversary gala for his tech firm next Friday night. The biggest investors in the state would be attending. Cynthia looked at me with cold eyes. She explained that social disparities make wealthy people feel uncomfortable. She stated bluntly that having a working-class mechanic mingling with venture capitalists would ruin the family image Blake had curated. Her words were deliberate, designed to make me feel small. She reached into her handbag and produced a white envelope. With a cruel sneer, she slid the envelope across the marble table. It stopped in front of my dinner plate. I looked down at the paper, then shifted my gaze back to her eyes. She stated that inside the envelope was a cashier's check for $5,000. The condition was absolute. I was instructed to deposit the money, call Blake on Thursday morning, and fake a severe medical emergency. I was ordered to tell Alicia that my heart was acting up and I could not attend the gala. They were paying me cash to disappear from their perfect lives. I did not touch the thick envelope. Cynthia's judgmental eyes drifted slowly down to my hands resting on the marble table. She stared intently at the deep calluses, the permanent dark grease stains wedged stubbornly under my cuticles, and the thick scars mapping across my knuckles. She openly sneered with pure disgust, visibly repulsed by the physical evidence of decades of hard manual labor. Those rough hands were my greatest pride. 30 years ago, before my private investments multiplied exponentially in the silent shadows of the financial world, those exact hands had rebuilt shattered car engines in a sweltering garage for 14 hours a day. I tore apart transmissions and breathed in toxic exhaust fumes daily just to pay the tuition for Alicia's university education. I worked myself to the bone so my brilliant daughter could graduate debt-free and conquer the corporate world on her own terms. I built my hidden financial empire quietly, choosing to continue living humbly in my old neighborhood because I desperately wanted Alicia to value authentic hard work over shallow inherited privilege. I deeply wanted her to choose a life partner based on solid moral character, not a bloated bank balance. Instead, she had chosen Blake Stanford, a man utterly obsessed with status and wealth. I watched Cynthia stare at my scarred hands with disgust, completely unaware that the quiet, supposedly poor man sitting directly across from her was the sole billionaire owner of the massive holding company that owned her precious son's entire career. I did not raise my voice in the quiet restaurant. I did not yell in anger or violently flip the table. True power requires absolute emotional discipline. I slowly shifted my gaze away from the sneering faces of Gregory and Cynthia Stanford. I looked directly at Alicia. I waited. I gave my only child the silence she desperately needed to speak up. I waited for her to forcefully push the envelope back across the table, to bravely defend the father who had sacrificed everything for her success, to firmly tell her cruel in-laws that their elitist behavior was entirely unacceptable. The agonizing silence stretched endlessly heavy and suffocating in the tense air. Blake noticed the tension and placed a highly possessive heavy hand on the back of Alicia's neck. It was a subtle, deeply controlling gesture designed to keep her firmly in line. Alicia physically flinched slightly under his grip. She kept her brown eyes locked desperately on the marble table, refusing to meet my gaze. I watched in heartbreak as she bit her lower lip so hard until a small drop of bright red blood pooled on the surface of her skin. She was completely terrified of her own husband. She remained completely silent, ultimately choosing her abuser's approval over her own father's dignity. Her deeply manipulated cowardice hit me infinitely harder than any elitist insult the arrogant Stanfords could ever throw at me. Seeing my strong, independent daughter reduced to a trembling, voiceless captive was the exact devastating spark that ignited a cold, deeply calculated fury deep within my chest. I realized in that heartbreaking moment that a simple fatherly conversation would never fix this dangerously broken marriage. The entire corrupt, toxic foundation of Blake Stanford's miserable, pathetic life had to burn completely to the ground today. I reached for the envelope. I did not rip it open or throw it back. I picked it up with a slow, deliberate motion, feeling the heavy, expensive grain of the paper, my thumbs still bearing the faint, unerasable ghosts of motor oil from decades past pressed against the pristine white surface. Cynthia leaned back slightly, a triumphant, almost predatory smile touching her thin lips. Gregory crossed his arms, settling into his chair, as if he had just successfully concluded a hostile corporate takeover. They believed they had won. They truly believed $5,000 was enough to erase a man's existence from his own daughter's life. Blake finally looked up, his jaw set, expecting my silent, humiliating retreat. I looked at Alicia. Her shoulders were hunched, her gaze still locked on her plate, refusing to intervene. Her silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket over the table. I slid the envelope back across the marble surface. It stopped exactly an inch from Cynthia's perfectly manicured fingers. "I will not be needing this," I said, my voice steady, completely devoid of the anger they clearly expected. The words hung in the air, cold and definitive. Cynthia's smile vanished instantly. Gregory uncrossed his arms, leaning forward, the veins in his neck suddenly visible. "Look here," Gregory growled, dropping the polite facade completely. "We are trying to be generous. Your presence at the gala is a liability. You understand that, don't you? It is simply business." I looked at Gregory, matching his hostility with absolute calm. "It is entirely about business, Gregory," I replied. "But not the kind you understand. You speak of pedigree and refinement, Cynthia. You talk about elite circles and corporate reputation, yet you sit here attempting to bribe a man you deem beneath you simply because his clothes do not match the decor of this restaurant. True refinement does not require a payout to maintain its illusion." Cynthia's face flushed a deep, mottled red. Her composure cracked under the weight of my words. "You have no idea how the real world operates," she snapped, her voice losing its measured cadence. "You spent your life under the hood of a car. You smell of grease and failure. Blake has built something extraordinary, and we will not allow you to drag him down with your pathetic blue-collar aesthetic." I did not flinch. "I spent my life rebuilding broken things so my daughter wouldn't have to," I countered, my eyes burning into hers. "And what did you build, Cynthia? You built a son who believes he can purchase his way out of family obligations. You raised a man who thinks power is defined by the price tag on his watch." Blake slammed his hand on the table, the silverware clattering loudly. "That is enough," Blake hissed, his face twisted in panic and rage. "You are embarrassing yourself, Emmanuel. Take the money and leave. Before I have security remove you." I turned my attention to Blake. The boy who had charmed Alicia with grand promises now looked small, desperate, and remarkably fragile. "You are terrified, Blake," I observed quietly. Not of my clothes and not of my profession. You are terrified because you recognize that no amount of money can cover the absolute void where your character should be. Gregory slammed both hands on the table, drawing the attention of several nearby patrons. "Get out!" Gregory demanded, his voice trembling with fury. "Get out of this restaurant immediately. You are a disgrace." I simply nodded. "I was just leaving," I said smoothly. I raised my hand slightly, catching the attention of the maitre d', who was hovering nervously near the edge of our section. He approached the table cautiously, expecting a scene. "The check, please," I instructed him. Gregory let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You cannot afford the water on this table, old man," Gregory scoffed. "Blake is paying. Now get out." I ignored Gregory completely. The maitre d' placed the leather billfold on the table. The total was over $2,000. I reached into the inner pocket of my faded corduroy jacket. I bypassed my worn leather wallet and pulled out a sleek, heavy, solid metal card. I placed it gently onto the silver tray. The dull clink of the titanium hitting the metal was the only sound at the table. It was an American Express Centurion card, the black card, the ultimate symbol of unfiltered, limitless financial power. I watched the maitre d's eyes widen as he recognized the heavy metal. He picked it up with extreme care, his posture instantly straightening. "Right away, Mr. Palmer," the maitre d' said, bowing his head respectfully before turning toward the register. The silence that followed at the table was absolute and deafening. Cynthia stared at the silver tray where the card had been, her mouth slightly agape, unable to process the visual contradiction. Gregory blinked rapidly, his arrogant sneer completely wiped from his face. He looked from me to Blake, searching for an explanation that did not exist. But the most profound reaction came from my son-in-law. Blake was staring at me, his eyes wide, the color draining from his face until he looked physically ill. The arrogant CEO, the man who believed he controlled every variable in his life, was looking at the father-in-law he had dismissed as a penniless mechanic, and he was terrified. The math was actively computing in his head. The realization that he had profoundly underestimated me was hitting him like a physical blow. He finally understood that the man sitting across from him was not a financial burden, but a deeply hidden power. The maitre d' returned promptly, holding the leather folio with the receipt. He handed it to me with both hands, a gesture of profound respect. "Thank you for your patronage, Mr. Palmer." "It is an honor," he said smoothly. I took the receipt, signed it quickly, and added a $500 tip. I slipped the heavy metal card back into my jacket pocket. I stood up slowly, making sure to make eye contact with each of them. I looked at Alicia last. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with shock, mirroring Blake's confusion. I did not say goodbye. I turned and walked away from the table, my footsteps steady on the marble floor. The elite patrons who had previously stared at me with contempt now watched me with quiet curiosity, picking up on the visible shift in power. As I reached the exit, I stopped near the heavy oak doors. A pristine brass trash receptacle stood near the coat check. I pulled the white envelope containing the $5,000 check from my pocket. I held it up for a brief second, ensuring that Blake, who had turned in his chair to watch me leave, saw exactly what I was holding. I dropped the envelope into the trash bin and walked out into the cool night air. The dropping of the black card was not intended to simply pay a bill. It was a calculated, deliberate strike to shatter their illusion of control. It was the absolute beginning of my adjustment. I knew Blake would not simply brush this off. The arrogant man I had just humiliated was now deeply panicked. He would be searching for answers, trying to uncover the source of my wealth and questioning everything he thought he knew about Alicia's family. And I needed to act quickly before he could cover his tracks. I walked toward my rusted Ford truck parked intentionally far from the gleaming luxury sedans. I unlocked the heavy door, the metallic clank loud in the quiet parking lot. I climbed into the driver's seat, the worn vinyl familiar and comforting. The engine sputtered slightly before roaring to life, a steady, reliable sound that contrasted sharply with the chaos I had just initiated. The dinner had confirmed everything I suspected about Blake and his family. They were ruthless, shallow, and entirely transactional. But my primary concern was Alicia. Her absolute silence at the table, her visible fear of her husband, told me a much darker story than simple social embarrassment. Blake was actively controlling her, breaking her spirit down piece by piece. I could not just reveal my wealth and expect the problem to solve itself. I needed to systematically dismantle the power structure Blake relied on. I needed to hit him where it would hurt the most in his professional domain, where his arrogance was absolute. I pulled my truck out of the parking lot and steered onto the main avenue. I did not drive toward my modest home. I needed a secure line. I parked in the dimly lit lot of a closed hardware store, the silence of the night wrapping around my truck. I pulled out a secured encrypted smartphone from the hidden compartment under my dashboard. This was not the cheap prepaid phone Blake saw me use. This device connected directly to the inner sanctum of Apex Holdings. I dialed a number I knew by heart. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Mr. Palmer," Miranda Yates said, her tone sharp and alert despite the late hour. "I need an immediate full forensic audit of Stanford Technologies." I commanded, my voice cold and hard. "I want access to every hidden ledger, every offshore wire, every single transaction Blake Stanford has authorized in the last 6 months." There was a brief pause on the line. Miranda was the lead auditor and legal counsel for Apex Holdings. She knew exactly what I was asking for. "Understood, sir," she replied. "I will initiate the primary bypass protocols immediately." Bachai Dushinabchai. The real work was about to begin. The dinner was over, but the conflict had only just ignited. Blake Stanford thought he had married the daughter of a simple mechanic. He was about to discover that he had invited a predator into his carefully constructed house of cards, and the audit was merely the first strike. I gripped the steering wheel, the leather cool against my scarred hands, entirely ready to tear down the empire I had quietly handed him. I dropped the encrypted phone onto the passenger seat and threw the truck into gear. The tires squealed violently against the asphalt as I peeled out of the abandoned lot. The drive to Blake and Alicia's neighborhood was a tense blur of streetlights and rising adrenaline. My mind raced through 1,000 terrifying scenarios. The man who was actively embezzling millions from my corporation was now physically threatening my daughter. I pushed the heavy accelerator to the floor. The engine roared loudly, pushing the old Ford far beyond its comfortable limits. I navigated the winding tree-lined roads leading up to the affluent hills. The sudden transition from the gritty industrial park to the manicured lawns of Stanford Estates felt like crossing into a hostile, foreign universe. I did not pull into their sprawling circular driveway. A sudden loud arrival would trigger a chaotic domestic dispute. I needed to control the environment completely. I killed the headlights and coasted the truck to a silent halt a full block away from their estate. I parked under the thick shadow of a massive oak tree. The neighborhood was dead quiet, save for the dull hum of central air conditioning units. I pulled out my personal cell phone and dialed Alicia's number. It rang 4 agonizing times before she finally answered. Her breathing was incredibly shallow and erratic. I kept my voice absolutely steady, masking the violent storm raging inside my chest. I commanded her to leave the house through the side garden gate immediately and walk to the dark truck parked down the street. I told her to make absolutely no noise. The line went dead. I sat in the dark cabin, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white. 2 minutes later, a slender figure emerged from the shadows of the manicured hedges. Alicia moved with a terrified, jerky urgency. She wore a thin silk robe over her clothes, clutching the collar tightly against the crisp night air. She climbed into the passenger side of the truck and slammed the heavy metal door shut. The dim ambient light from the street lamp illuminated her face. Her cheeks were stained with fresh tears, her eyes wide with a frantic, hunted look. But it was not her face that made the breath catch in my throat, it was her left arm. As she reached out to grab my hand, the sleeve of her silk robe slipped back. A dark, viciously purple bruise wrapped entirely around her delicate wrist. The marks were in the distinct shape of a large, brutal handprint. Blake had grabbed her with enough violent force to rupture the blood vessels beneath her skin. A blinding, deafening rage exploded directly behind my eyes. I stared at the dark bruises, my mind flashing back to the fearless little girl who used to climb the tallest trees in our neighborhood. She used to scrape her knees on the pavement and jump right back up without ever shedding a single tear. That brave, unbreakable child had been systematically worn down into this trembling captive. Every protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to march up that driveway, kick the mahogany front door off its hinges, and beat Blake Stanford until he could no longer stand. I wanted to tear him apart with my bare hands. I forced myself to inhale deeply, locking the monster inside a cage. Physical violence would only result in my immediate arrest and allow Blake to play the victim for the police. I needed a weapon far more destructive than my fists. I gently took her uninjured hand. I asked her exactly what Blake was forcing her to sign. Alicia took a ragged breath and explained the absolute nightmare unfolding inside the house. She said Blake had come home from the restaurant completely unhinged. He was screaming at the top of his lungs that their primary business accounts had been inexplicably frozen. He claimed a massive vendor payment was due by tomorrow morning, and if it bounced, the company would be seized by federal regulators. To secure an emergency overnight bridge loan from a private lender, the bank required dual signatures from all corporate directors. Because Blake had secretly named Alicia as the sole director of his new shell subsidiary, her signature was legally mandatory to release the funds. He had slammed a 50-page joint liability contract onto the kitchen island. He demanded she sign away her entire financial future immediately. Alicia wept, confessing that she did not understand the dense legal jargon, but Blake completely refused to let her read the fine print. He just gripped her wrist with crushing force and shoved a pen into her hand. He shouted that a loyal wife would sign the documents without asking stupid questions. The sheer audacity of his scheme was breathtaking. Blake was not securing a bridge loan to save the failing company. He was using Alicia's signature to take out a massive line of credit against her name. He intended to drain that cash, immediately wire the funds to his offshore accounts, and flee the country. He was going to leave my daughter legally responsible for millions of dollars in fraudulent debt. It was the perfect escape plan for a cornered sociopath. I let go of her hand and looked out the windshield at the dark, silent street. I was not going to let him escape. I was going to hand him the exact rope he needed to hang himself. I turned to Alicia and wiped the tears from her cheek. I told her I needed her to be braver than she had ever been in her entire life. I instructed her to go back into that house and sit down at the kitchen island. I told her to pick up that pen and sign every single page of that joint liability contract. Alicia stared at me in pure shock. Her mouth opened in a silent protest. I quickly raised my hand to stop her panic. I explained the lethal counterstrike clearly. She was going to sign the papers, but she was not going to use her real legally binding signature. I reminded Alicia of a silly game we used to play when she was a teenager. She used to practice forging the signatures of famous historical figures for her art projects. I told her to alter the slant of her letters slightly. I told her to loop her vowels backward and skip the middle initial she always used on official banking documents. I commanded her to create a perfectly crafted fake signature that looked genuine to Blake's frantic eyes, but would be thrown out instantly by any competent handwriting expert during a federal fraud investigation. By doing this, she would give Blake a legally useless document. He would submit the fraudulent contract to the private lender, fully believing he had secured his stolen cash. When the bank inevitably discovered the irregular signatures, they would instantly trigger a massive internal fraud alert. They would freeze the funds, contact the authorities, and trap Blake in a federal crime of his own making. He would be holding a forged document that he forced his wife to sign under extreme duress. Alicia stopped crying entirely. The cold logic of the plan pierced directly through her thick cloud of panic. The realization that she could fight back without engaging in a physical screaming match transformed her posture. The hunted look in her eyes slowly hardened into a sharp, cold determination. I told her to play the part of the submissive, terrified wife flawlessly. She needed to let Blake believe he had won. She needed to let him feel powerful and entirely in control. A man blinded by his own arrogance never looks down to see the trap closing around his ankles. I promised her that by tomorrow afternoon, Blake Stanford would no longer be a threat to anyone. Alicia nodded firmly. She pulled the thin silk robe tight around her shoulders. She took one final deep breath and opened the heavy truck door. She stepped out into the cool night and walked back toward the sprawling house. I sat in the darkness, watching her silhouette disappear behind the manicured hedges. The trap was securely set. The bait was in place. Now all I had to do was wait for the rat to bite. The morning sun cast long shadows across the faded linoleum floor of my kitchen. I sat at the small wooden table, staring at the steam rising from my black coffee. The trap was meticulously set, but I knew Blake Stanford would not wait long to assess the damage from the previous night. I anticipated his arrival perfectly. I knew his immense paranoia would demand immediate answers. Sure enough, the heavy crunch of expensive tires on my gravel driveway broke the quiet morning silence precisely at 7 o'clock. I stood up from my wooden chair and walked slowly to the front window. Blake's gleaming silver Porsche looked absurdly out of place, parked next to my rusted Ford truck and the overgrown azalea bushes lining my front porch. He stepped out of his luxury vehicle wearing a sharply tailored navy suit, looking every bit the pristine corporate executive. In his hands, he carried a massive, absurdly expensive fruit basket wrapped in clear cellophane and tied with a thick gold ribbon. It was the ultimate hollow gesture. It was a generic corporate apology gift bought specifically to placate a man he considered entirely beneath him. I unlocked the front door before he even had a chance to knock. I pulled the screen door open and looked at him with a carefully constructed expression of mild surprise. Blake pasted a thoroughly unconvincing look of deep remorse across his handsome face. He practically shoved the heavy fruit basket into my hands as he stepped over the threshold without waiting for an actual invitation to enter my home. The sweet, overpowering smell of imported luxury cologne followed him inside, completely drowning out the comforting scent of my brewing coffee. Blake stood awkwardly in the center of my small living room. His eyes immediately began darting around the space, taking in the worn fabric of my sofa, the chipped paint on the baseboards, and the small box television resting on a secondhand wooden stand. He was actively searching for a contradiction. He was desperately looking for any hidden sign of luxury that might explain the titanium credit card I had dropped on the restaurant table just a few hours ago. He found absolutely nothing. My home was exactly what it appeared to be on the surface. It was a modest refuge for an aging mechanic. Blake exhaled slightly, his tense shoulders relaxing just a fraction. He turned his attention back to me, adopting a highly practiced tone of sincere regret. He claimed he was profoundly embarrassed by his parents' behavior at the dinner. He claimed he had spent the entire night arguing with them about their unacceptable elitism. He swore he respected me deeply and highly valued my place in Alicia's life. Every single word falling from his mouth was a calculated lie. I placed the ridiculous fruit basket on the coffee table and offered him a seat. I maintained a polite, neutral silence, forcing him to fill the uncomfortable void. Blake sat on the edge of the worn sofa cushion, looking exactly like a man terrified of catching a disease from the upholstery. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and shifted his conversational strategy. He casually mentioned how incredibly expensive the dinner was. He noted how surprised he was that I managed to cover such a massive bill so easily. The subtle interrogation had officially begun. He was testing the waters, trying to gauge my actual financial depth without sounding overly desperate. He asked if I had recently come into a sudden inheritance, or if I had been hiding a secret lottery win from Alicia. His voice was light and conversational, but his eyes were sharp and unblinking, tracking my every micro-expression. I walked over to the mantel above the fireplace instead of answering him directly. I picked up a framed silver photograph of my late wife, Sylvia. I stared at her gentle smile, feeling the familiar dull ache in my chest. Sylvia had been the absolute light of my world. 30 years ago, we had saved every single penny we earned to buy our first real house. But a slick, fast-talking con artist posing as a real estate developer had stolen our entire life savings in a fraudulent investment scheme. The devastating financial ruin had broken Sylvia. She took on 3 grueling jobs just to help us recover, working herself into severe physical exhaustion. Her heart gave out 2 years later. She literally worked herself into an early grave because of a greedy predator. I made a sacred vow over her casket that I would never allow financial greed to destroy our family again. That unbreakable vow was the sole reason I built my massive corporate empire in complete secrecy. It was the exact reason I was currently looking at the ruthless predator sitting on my sofa. I placed Sylvia's picture back on the mantel and faced Blake. I knew exactly what he needed to hear. He needed to believe that his grand illusion of superiority was still entirely intact. I let out a long, heavy sigh and rubbed the back of my neck, playing the role of an embarrassed, tired old man perfectly. I looked down at the floor, refusing to meet his probing eyes. I told Blake the truth was incredibly humiliating. I confessed that the black card was not actually mine. I explained that I currently worked part-time doing custom mechanical restorations for an extremely wealthy vintage car collector on the other side of the city. I claimed my employer had given me the novelty metal card as a prop to run errands and pick up expensive auto parts. I told Blake that when his parents began insulting me at the restaurant, my fragile pride got the better of me. I used my employer's corporate expense card to pay for the dinner purely to save face and stop the relentless humiliation in front of my daughter. I promised him I would be paying my boss back out of my meager retirement savings for the next 3 years. I let my voice crack slightly on the last sentence, painting a pathetic picture of a desperate father trying to look impressive in front of his wealthy son-in-law. The transformation in Blake was instantaneous and genuinely revolting to witness. The lingering tension completely vanished from his posture. He exhaled a massive, audible sigh of relief. The sheer terror that had gripped him the previous night evaporated entirely, replaced instantly by his natural toxic arrogance. A cruel, mocking smirk crossed his handsome face. He stood up from the sofa, smoothing the wrinkles from his expensive suit jacket with a renewed sense of superiority. He patted me firmly on the shoulder, a physical gesture dripping with profound condescension. He told me I should not have done something so financially reckless, but he claimed he understood the pathetic need to protect my fragile male ego. He advised me to stick to my lane in the future and let him handle the sophisticated matters. Blake walked out of my front door without a backward glance, completely confident that his intricate plan to ruin my daughter and steal millions of dollars remained perfectly safe. I stood in the doorway and watched his silver Porsche speed away down the street. He thought he had easily outsmarted a foolish old mechanic. He had absolutely no real idea that he had just swallowed the dangerous bait completely whole and sealed his inevitable doom. The rumble of the silver Porsche faded into the quiet hum of the suburban morning. I stood motionless in my narrow hallway, tracking the sound until it completely disappeared down the street. The air in my living room still carried the cloying scent of Blake's imported cologne. It was a lingering reminder of his supreme, unearned arrogance. I did not have a moment to process the sheer audacity of his visit. A sharp, rhythmic knock echoed from the back of the house. It was the heavy wooden door leading to the kitchen. I turned away from the front window and walked swiftly across the faded linoleum floor. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Miranda Yates stood on the small concrete porch. My lead auditor wore a pristine charcoal suit, her expression carved from absolute stone. She carried two thick, bulging leather briefcases. She stepped past me without waiting for a formal invitation, her sharp heels clicking methodically against the kitchen floor. Miranda did not offer a polite morning greeting. She swung her heavy briefcases onto my scratched wooden dining table. She unclasped the brass locks with two sharp, aggressive snaps. She pulled out a massive stack of heavily tabbed financial dossiers and slammed them down directly next to my cooling cup of black coffee. The loud thud rattled the ceramic mug. I locked the back door and approached the table, reading the severe intensity in her dark eyes. I asked her to give me the exact bottom line. I expected to hear a story of a struggling chief executive officer drowning in poor market decisions. I expected a narrative of foolish investments and arrogant overspending. Miranda looked at me and shook her head with absolute disgust. She stated that Blake Stanford was not a failing executive. She declared that he was an active, highly sophisticated thief. She spread the printed ledgers across the table, pointing a manicured finger at a series of highlighted routing numbers. She detailed the exact anatomy of his corporate betrayal. Blake had spent the last 6 months aggressively bleeding the operational capital of Stanford Technologies. He was not losing money to bad contracts. He was actively creating phantom vendor invoices to authorize massive, unchecked wire transfers. Miranda pulled out a secondary file containing real estate records. She slapped a glossy photograph onto the table. It showed a sprawling gated mansion sitting on 12 acres of prime coastal property. She informed me that Blake had secretly purchased this multi-million-dollar estate 2 weeks ago. The property deed was registered explicitly under the names of Gregory and Cynthia Stanford. He had used my company's stolen capital to buy his arrogant parents a palace. This was the exact reason they felt so untouchably superior at the restaurant the previous night. They believed their son was a self-made titan, providing them with generational wealth. I stared at the photograph of the mansion, feeling the cold anger solidifying in my chest. But Miranda was not finished. She pulled out a third stack of heavily redacted bank statements tracing a different set of wire transfers. She explained that the real estate purchase only accounted for half of the missing capital. The other half had been aggressively funneled into a labyrinth of offshore holding accounts before disappearing into unregulated wire services. Miranda had utilized her top forensic analysts to crack the final destination of those specific funds. She revealed that Blake was drowning in massive underground gambling debts. He owed millions to an illicit, highly dangerous sports betting syndicate operating out of a neighboring state. His sudden panic the previous night, his violent outburst at his home, and his desperate need for an emergency bridge loan were all directly tied to this terrifying reality. His illegal creditors were demanding immediate payment, and he had completely exhausted the primary company accounts to satisfy them. I picked up the ledgers, my eyes scanning the devastating columns of red ink. Blake was not merely arrogant. He was a cornered, desperate animal. He had burned through $30 million of my secret capital infusion to finance his parents' elitist lifestyle and his own toxic addictions. He had stood in my living room just minutes ago wearing a fake smile and mocking my supposed poverty while secretly standing on the absolute brink of total ruin. I asked Miranda how a theft of this staggering magnitude could bypass the internal compliance officers. I demanded to know how Blake intended to survive the inevitable federal audit. A crime of this size leaves a massive paper trail. The Securities and Exchange Commission would naturally freeze the accounts, arrest the executives, and seize the stolen assets. Blake was arrogant, but he was not completely stupid. He had to know the walls were closing in on his scheme. Miranda's expression turned utterly lethal. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a single thin red folder. She placed it squarely in the center of the table, separated from the rest of the financial ruin. She told me this was the most fatal detail of the entire investigation. She instructed me to look at the legal structuring of the toxic debt. I opened the red folder and read the finalized incorporation documents. Blake had not stolen the money directly from the primary corporate entity. He had established a newly formed subsidiary company 3 months prior. He had legally transferred all the fraudulent vendor contracts, the massive gambling debts, and the illicit offshore wire transfers entirely into this specific subsidiary. He had carefully built a toxic dumping ground to completely isolate the primary company from the impending federal fallout. I read the executive registry attached to the subsidiary. The breath caught violently in my throat. I stared at the name printed on the sole director line. It was Alicia Palmer Stanford. My daughter was legally listed as the absolute owner and primary authorizing officer of the fraudulent shell company. Blake had not put his own name on a single toxic document. He had forged her signature on the initial incorporation papers and quietly positioned her to absorb the entire blast radius of the crime. Miranda watched my face darken as the horrific reality set in. She confirmed my worst fears out loud. She stated that when the federal investigators finally arrived to audit the missing millions, the legal paper trail would bypass Blake completely. The evidence would point directly and exclusively to Alicia. Blake was actively framing his own wife to take the fall. He intended to walk away clean while Alicia faced decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and massive embezzlement. The crushing weight of his profound evil hit me with the force of a freight train. The frantic phone call from Alicia the previous night replayed in my mind with terrifying clarity. Blake had violently forced her to sign a massive stack of joint liability contracts and bank guarantees. He needed those specific signatures to finalize the transfer of the toxic debt directly onto her name. He was sealing her fate. I looked down at my scarred hands, feeling a dangerous primitive rage coursing through my veins. My beautiful, brilliant daughter was sleeping in a house with a man who was actively building her prison cell. He was going to sacrifice her life to save his own miserable skin. He genuinely believed she would go down quietly, protecting him out of fear and submissive loyalty. I looked up from the documents and met Miranda's sharp gaze. I did not yell. I did not throw the coffee mug against the wall. The cold, calculating billionaire emerged entirely, locking away the emotional father. I told Miranda that Blake's attempt to frame Alicia was the exact weapon we were going to use to execute him. I explained the trap I had set the night before. I revealed that the bank guarantees Alicia had signed under his violent duress were completely covered in perfectly crafted fake signatures. Blake thought he possessed legally binding documents to finalize his escape. Instead, he was currently holding blatant forgeries that would trigger an immediate catastrophic fraud alert the second he attempted to submit them to the private lenders. Miranda's lips curled into a fierce, predatory smile. She instantly recognized the sheer brilliance of the snare. She stated that the forged signatures would completely paralyze the bridge loan starving Blake of the cash he needed to pay his violent creditors today. The bank would instantly flag the transaction, freezing his operational mobility entirely. I nodded slowly, tapping my finger against the fraudulent subsidiary documents. I told Miranda that we were going to let Blake submit those fake signatures today. We were going to let him trigger his own destruction, but we needed to isolate him completely before the trap snapped shut. I commanded Miranda to prepare the final legal strike for the emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. The era of the silent investor was officially over. I was going to rip the Stanford family apart piece by piece, and I was going to start by cutting off their absolute last avenue of escape. I sat across the scratched wooden table from Miranda Yates inside my quiet kitchen. I poured myself another cup of black coffee, feeling the warm ceramic against my palms. I felt remarkably calm despite the magnitude of the corporate warfare we were actively conducting. The stark reality of Blake Stanford actively framing my daughter required a brutal and instantaneous response. We could not wait for the bank to process Alicia's forged signatures and flag the fraudulent transaction organically. Blake was an incredibly desperate man, and desperate men make highly unpredictable and extremely dangerous moves. I needed to paralyze his operational capacity completely before he could inflict any collateral damage on my family. I leaned forward and instructed Miranda to initiate a phantom protocol across the entire financial network of Stanford Technologies. During the early days of my hidden wealth accumulation, I had invested heavily in advanced cybersecurity infrastructure. I quickly understood that absolute digital control was the ultimate corporate weapon. I had secretly hardwired a master override switch into the digital architecture of Blake's company the exact moment my shell corporation acquired it. I told Miranda to execute that override command immediately. She nodded sharply and typed a rapid sequence of complex commands into her encrypted laptop. I watched the green progress bar on her screen fill with lethal speed. She explained that she was deploying a system-wide lockout disguised as a critical, unscheduled server migration. Every executive login credential, every administrative access code, and every single wire transfer portal was instantly disabled. Anyone attempting to access the primary accounting software would be met with a generic maintenance notification. I nodded in approval. Blake Stanford was now entirely locked inside a burning building with absolutely no exit doors. My daughter was finally safe from his digital reach. Across the city, inside the gleaming glass tower of Stanford Technologies, Blake Stanford sat behind his massive mahogany desk. The high-rise windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the bustling city below, but Blake saw absolutely nothing. His vision was entirely tunneled on the desperate need for basic survival. His bespoke navy suit jacket was draped carelessly over an imported leather chair. A thick layer of nervous sweat coated his forehead, causing his skin to shine under the bright fluorescent lights. He stared intensely at the dual monitors illuminating his private executive suite. The heavy stack of freshly signed joint liability contracts sat right next to his expensive keyboard. He believed Alicia's forced signatures were his ultimate salvation. He genuinely thought he had successfully manipulated his terrified wife into absorbing the entire legal liability for his massive underground gambling debts. The deadline to pay his illicit, highly dangerous creditors was rapidly approaching. He had exactly 3 hours before the syndicate initiated their violent collection protocols. They had made their brutal intentions perfectly clear during a brief, terrifying phone call the previous night. Blake knew he could not delay the electronic transfer any longer. He picked up his wireless mouse and navigated directly to the offshore banking portal. He intended to leverage the newly signed contracts to secure an instant cash advance against the subsidiary's available credit line. He typed his administrative credentials into the login screen with visibly trembling fingers. He pressed the enter key with heavy force, fully expecting to see the millions of stolen dollars materialize before his eyes. He planned to wire the illicit funds to the Cayman Islands and immediately book a first-class ticket out of the country to join his mistress. The computer screen flickered briefly. Instead of the familiar banking dashboard loading, a solid crimson box materialized in the absolute center of the monitor. Bold white letters spelled out a devastating message. Access denied. Critical server migration in progress. All administrative privileges temporarily suspended. Blake stared blindly at the screen, his breath catching painfully in his throat. He aggressively slammed his index finger against the refresh button. The page reloaded instantly, displaying the same crimson error message. A cold, suffocating panic gripped his chest tightly. He furiously typed his password a second time, pressing the keys with enough violent force to crack the plastic keyboard. The system violently rejected him again. He picked up his desk phone and immediately dialed the head of the information technology department. The call went straight to an automated voicemail system. He slammed the receiver down so hard the plastic base shattered into several sharp pieces. He was the chief executive officer. He was supposed to have absolute, unquestionable authority over the digital infrastructure of his own company. Yet, he was completely locked out of his own corporate treasury. The pristine walls of his luxurious office suddenly felt like they were closing in on him. He ran his shaking hands through his perfectly styled hair, completely ruining the expensive cut. He stared wildly at the digital clock on his office wall. He had less than 3 hours remaining. The criminal syndicate would not accept a scheduled server migration as a valid excuse for missing a multi-million-dollar payment. They would send violent enforcers directly to his luxury condo. They would destroy his perfect curated life. He had exhausted every single corporate loophole available to him. He had bled the company completely dry over the last 6 months. He possessed no personal liquid assets left to liquidate. He was entirely trapped in a cage of his own making, suffocating under the crushing weight of his inevitable and highly public downfall. Blind desperation quickly stripped away the last remaining shreds of Blake's rational thought. He needed raw cash immediately, regardless of the source. He reached into his slacks and grabbed his cell phone. He dialed his parents' private number with frantic, unfiltered urgency. Gregory Stanford answered on the second ring, utilizing his typical, arrogant, booming tone. Blake did not offer a polite morning greeting. He screamed directly into the receiver, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. He told his father that the corporate accounts were completely frozen due to a catastrophic system error. He confessed loudly that he was mere hours away from facing highly violent consequences for a massive secret financial debt. Gregory demanded to know exactly what was happening, his arrogant tone instantly shifting into sudden, sharp alarm. Blake ignored his father's frantic questions entirely. He shouted that there was only one unencumbered asset left that could be liquidated fast enough to cover the immediate cash shortage. He aggressively ordered his parents to drive straight to Emmanuel Palmer's working-class neighborhood right now. He screamed at them to use any means necessary to force the pathetic old mechanic to sign over the legal deed to his house. Blake explicitly demanded that they coerce Emmanuel into selling his property for a fraction of its true value today. He yelled that his actual physical life depended entirely on getting the equity from that modest house before noon. The call disconnected abruptly. Blake threw the phone violently across the room, leaving his parents completely shocked but highly motivated to do his brutal bidding. The financial trap had successfully triggered the exact physical confrontation I was waiting for. I leaned back in my wooden chair and waited for the Stanford family to finally arrive at my front door. I sat in my wooden chair, the cold coffee sitting forgotten on the table. The silence of my modest living room was heavy, thick with the anticipation of the incoming storm. Miranda had already retreated to the back room to finalize the legal death blow for the morning board meeting. I did not have to wait long for Blake's desperate command to echo back to me. The roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet suburban morning. I looked through the faded lace curtains just in time to see a gleaming black Mercedes-Benz tear around the corner. It did not park on the quiet street. It did not stop in the concrete driveway. The heavy luxury sedan hopped the curb, its tires tearing violently through my carefully tended front lawn. The heavy wheels crushed the blooming azalea bushes I had planted with Sylvia 20 years ago. Those flowers had been her absolute favorite, a symbol of our enduring resilience after the financial ruin we had suffered. Now, they were ground into the mud under the weight of imported German rubber. The car skidded to a violent halt inches from my wooden porch steps. The doors flew open before the engine even cut off. Gregory and Cynthia Stanford stepped out into the humid morning air. The sophisticated, polite mask they had worn at the French restaurant the night before was completely gone. In its place was the raw, ugly desperation of cornered animals. They marched up my wooden steps with heavy, aggressive strides. The porch boards groaned loudly under Gregory's weight. He did not bother to knock or announce his presence. He simply raised his expensive leather shoe and kicked my screen door open. The flimsy latch snapped instantly, the metal frame slamming violently against the interior siding of my house. They stormed into my living room like a hostile invading army. Cynthia's face was twisted into a grotesque mask of pure contempt. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled, her perfect hair slightly disheveled from the frantic drive across the city. Gregory marched directly toward me, his face flushed a dangerous mottled purple. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. He slammed the documents down onto my fragile coffee table with enough force to crack the glass center. It was a pre-written real estate deed. He leaned over the table, invading my personal space, his breath smelling stale and sour from absolute panic. He demanded I pick up a pen and sign over the legal rights to my property immediately. He shouted that the deed transferred ownership of my home to his holding company for a fraction of its actual market value. He claimed this was the absolute only way to generate the immediate liquid cash necessary to save my daughter's marriage from total bankruptcy. Cynthia stepped forward, her voice a shrill, piercing screech. She completely abandoned any pretense of human decency. She hurled vicious insults, calling my home a disgusting gutter and mocking my entire existence as a worthless blue-collar laborer. She stated that people of my low class were entirely disposable, born only to serve the needs of their betters. She shrieked that it was my ultimate duty to sacrifice my pathetic little life to protect a superior family like the Stanfords. She claimed Alicia would be thrown out onto the streets to starve if I did not instantly surrender my only valuable asset. Their arrogance was truly breathtaking. They were actively trying to steal my home to pay for the underground gambling debts their son had accrued with my stolen corporate funds. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend the home I had shared with my late wife. I simply looked at the fraudulent deed resting on the cracked glass. I remembered the harsh lessons I learned working on the brutal loading docks in my impoverished youth. The absolute loudest, angriest man in the entire room is always the weakest. True, untouchable power never has to shout to make its undeniable presence felt. I turned my back on Gregory and Cynthia entirely. I walked away from the coffee table and moved slowly toward the open kitchen counter. I picked up the glass carafe and poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee. The dark liquid steamed in the ceramic mug. As my left hand held the handle, my right hand slid smoothly beneath the edge of the wooden counter. My fingers found the small metallic device I had installed years ago for home security. I pressed the hidden sound-activated record button with absolute precision. A tiny red light blinked once, confirming that every single threat, every vicious insult, and every extortion demand echoing through my living room was now being captured in crystal-clear digital audio. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter coffee. I turned back around to face the intruders. I leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing my ankles, and simply watched them. I did not speak a single word. I offered absolutely no reaction to their frantic screaming. I just let my cold, dead eyes rest on their panicked faces, watching them drown in their own pathetic hysteria. My total, chilling silence hit Gregory like a physical blow. He had expected me to cower. He had expected me to beg for mercy, to cry about my poor daughter, or to scream back in futile anger. My absolute stillness confused and terrified him. He pointed a violently trembling finger directly at my chest, demanding I speak immediately. He arrogantly ordered me to obey his strict commands and sign the legal papers to save my completely useless family. I simply took another sip of my coffee, keeping my eyes locked dead onto his flushed face. The silence stretched out heavy and suffocating. It forced Gregory to hear the desperate echo of his own pathetic shouting bouncing off the peeling wallpaper. Cynthia grabbed his arm, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch as she urged him to make me sign the documents before the banks opened. The sheer disrespect of my silence pushed Gregory over the absolute edge of his fragile sanity. His massive ego could not comprehend a working-class mechanic refusing to bow to his demands. His face twisted into a mask of pure, uncontrolled rage. He let out a primal, furious roar and charged across the small living room space. He closed the distance between us in 3 heavy strides. He reached out with both hands, grabbing the front of my shirt violently. He shoved me back against the kitchen counter, causing my coffee mug to crash onto the linoleum floor. The hot liquid splashed across our shoes. Gregory raised his heavy right fist, pulling it back to strike my face. He screamed that he would beat the signature out of me if he had to break every bone in my hands. He had officially crossed the line from financial extortion into violent criminal assault. The audio recorder captured every single second of the brutal escalation. The heavy, lethal steel trap was now fully and permanently closed tight around his sweating neck. Gregory's heavy right fist swung downward with the clumsy momentum of a man whose life had been fought exclusively with fountain pens. He expected an aging mechanic to collapse under his sudden outburst of violence. He fundamentally misunderstood the type of man he had chosen to assault. My muscle memory was forged decades ago on the unforgiving concrete of the city's industrial loading docks. Before his knuckles could graze my unprotected jaw, I shifted my weight slightly left, allowing his wild momentum to carry him forward off balance. I brought my left hand up in a rapid, fluid motion, firmly gripping his thick wrist. Simultaneously, my right hand shot up to secure his elbow. I pivoted sharply on my heel, using his own aggressive forward momentum completely against him. I twisted his arm into an agonizing lock and drove him straight hard down. Gregory hit the faded hardwood floor of my living room with a sickening thud. The breath exploded from his lungs in a ragged gasp. I kept my knee pressed firmly between his shoulder blades, applying just enough precise pressure to keep him pinned against the wooden planks without snapping his arm. The sudden, violent reversal of power shattered the air in the room. Cynthia let out a shrill, hysterical shriek. The sound tore through the quiet house like a siren. She stumbled backward, her expensive high heels catching on the edge of the woven area rug. She crashed hard against the wooden doorframe, her hands flying to her mouth in absolute horror. She stared at her husband, the supposed untouchable patriarch of the Stanford Empire, groveling helplessly on the dusty, worn floor of a simple working-class mechanic. Gregory squirmed desperately beneath my knee. He spat out a string of vicious curses, his face pressed uncomfortably against the cold floorboards. He demanded I release him instantly, threatening to unleash a legion of corporate attorneys to destroy my miserable life. I ignored his pathetic blustering entirely. With my right hand free, I reached calmly into my pocket and retrieved my cell phone. I did not break my steady, unblinking gaze from Cynthia's terrified eyes as I dialed the emergency services number. The operator answered on the second ring. I kept my voice absolutely flat, projecting the serene authority of a man in complete control of a volatile situation. I clearly stated my name and my exact address. I reported an active home invasion and an ongoing physical assault. I informed the operator that 2 aggressive intruders had kicked open my front screen door, attempted to extort me for real estate, and physically attacked me. I confirmed the primary male assailant was securely restrained on the hardwood floor, formally requesting an immediate armed police dispatch. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Cynthia finally found her voice. Her initial shock violently morphed back into her deeply ingrained toxic entitlement. She screamed that I was completely insane to call the authorities. She shouted that the police would never believe a nobody like me over a family of their immense social standing. She promised they would definitely bury me under so many malicious prosecution lawsuits that I would lose the very house I was trying to protect. I simply maintained my heavy pressure on Gregory's back. I informed Cynthia that the police response time in this district was incredibly efficient. I advised her to spend the next 4 minutes figuring out exactly how she was going to explain forced entry and assault to armed officers of the law. Gregory groaned, thrashing his legs against the floor, but my grip remained utterly unbreakable. The harsh reality of his impending criminal arrest began to slowly penetrate his incredibly thick skull. The piercing wail of police sirens cut through the morning air less than 3 minutes later. The sound grew rapidly louder, echoing off the modest houses of my quiet neighborhood. I saw the flashing red and blue lights reflect vividly against my living room windows. Heavy car doors slammed shut outside. I heard the sharp crunch of heavy boots sprinting up my wooden porch steps. I immediately released Gregory's arm and stepped back, raising both of my hands to show I was completely unarmed and entirely compliant. 2 armed police officers burst through the broken screen door, their hands resting cautiously on their service belts. They quickly assessed the chaotic scene. Gregory scrambled up from the floor, his face flushed with embarrassment and furious exertion. He frantically brushed the dust off his ruined designer suit. He instantly pointed an accusatory finger directly at my face. He launched into a frantic, highly rehearsed lie with the smooth delivery of a lifelong manipulator. He aggressively informed the officers that he and his wife were prominent, highly respected citizens. He claimed they had come to my home for a peaceful real estate negotiation. He told the police that I had suddenly become violently unhinged when they presented a fair market offer. He swore I had attacked him completely unprovoked, throwing him to the ground like a deranged maniac. Cynthia stepped forward instantly, producing fake, trembling tears to corroborate his absurd narrative. She wept openly, clutching her chest, playing the role of a traumatized victim flawlessly. She begged the officers to arrest me for brutalizing her husband. The senior officer turned his stern gaze toward me, clearly weighing the heavy, serious criminal accusations. I did not attempt to interrupt Gregory's frantic lies. I did not raise my voice in defensive anger. I allowed them to dig their own graves as deeply as possible in front of the authorities. When Gregory finally paused to catch his breath, leaving a tense silence in the room, I slowly and deliberately lowered my hands. I spoke directly to the senior officer with unwavering calm. I stated that the 2 frantic individuals had forcefully and violently kicked open my locked screen door, attempted to coerce me into signing a fraudulent property deed to cover their son's illicit debts, and subsequently assaulted me when I refused. The officer frowned, noting the stark contrast between Gregory's sweating hysteria and my absolute tranquility. He asked if I currently had any actual tangible proof to definitively support my severe allegations. I reached under the kitchen counter and retrieved the metallic audio recorder. I placed it firmly on the cracked glass and pressed the playback button. The speaker crackled, filling the silent room with digital audio. The recording played Gregory's arrogant voice perfectly. It played the sound of my door being kicked open. It played Cynthia's horrific insults regarding my social class. It captured Gregory explicitly demanding I sign over my home to save his son from loan sharks. Finally, it played the terrifying sound of Gregory charging across the room, the crash of the coffee mug, and his violent threat to break every bone in my hands. The color drained from Gregory's face. Cynthia's fake tears stopped instantly. The senior officer stared at the recorder, then turned his gaze back to them. The elite couple is handcuffed and dragged into the back of a squad car in front of the entire working-class neighborhood. The Stanford family's pristine reputation sustains a fatal blow. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers slowly disappeared down the quiet suburban street, carrying Gregory and Cynthia Stanford directly toward a cramped holding cell at the local precinct. The previously silent working-class neighborhood had completely spilled out onto their front porches and manicured lawns. My neighbors stood buzzing with the shocking spectacle of two arrogant, highly elite socialites being hauled away in heavy metal handcuffs. I ignored the growing crowd and stepped back inside my house, pulling the shattered wooden screen door shut behind me. The broken latch was an incredibly small price to pay for the permanent and highly public destruction of their pristine reputation. I grabbed a straw broom from the corner to sweep up the broken ceramic shards of my shattered coffee mug, but the sharp, urgent ring of my encrypted cell phone instantly interrupted the quiet room. I pulled the sleek device from my pocket and answered immediately. Miranda Yates was on the line, and her typically composed, robotic voice carried a sharp edge of genuine alarm. She did not ask about the violent police visit or the physical assault. She bypassed the standard pleasantries entirely and demanded my absolute and undivided attention. Miranda informed me that she had finally cracked the deepest, most heavily guarded layer of the encrypted ledgers Blake had buried inside the corporate servers. The aggressive forensic audit revealed a massive, terrifying discrepancy that completely altered our understanding of the battlefield. The millions of dollars Blake had stolen from Stanford Technologies were not merely squandered on the sprawling coastal estate for his parents or his reckless underground gambling debts. Those expenditures were certainly substantial, but they were effectively just a convenient smokescreen designed to hide a much larger crime. The vast majority of the embezzled corporate capital had been systematically wired through a complex maze of shell corporations directly to a highly secure offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands. I stood perfectly still in the center of my living room, listening to the brutal mechanical precision of his theft. I asked Miranda who exactly held the legal authority over the offshore trust. Her answer sent a wave of absolute sickening disgust washing over me. The International Trust was entirely registered under the sole name of Cynthia Stanford. Gregory and Cynthia had not just been ignorant, innocent beneficiaries of their son and his massive corporate fraud. They were active, willing conspirators hoarding the stolen wealth in an untouchable international haven. Their hysterical panic in my living room was not about saving Blake from violent loan sharks. It was about desperately protecting their illicit Cayman fortune from being drained to cover his immediate local debts. They wanted to force me to sacrifice my modest home to save their stolen millions. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of the Stanford family dynamic was now completely exposed. They functioned as a coordinated parasite. But Miranda was not finished delivering the devastating intelligence. She continued her rapid report, finally piecing together the ultimate lethal timeline of his hidden agenda. She had successfully intercepted a series of highly classified digital flight logs and chartered travel itineraries buried deep within his personal encrypted emails. Blake had secretly booked a private, untraceable jet, scheduled to depart from an isolated airstrip on the outskirts of the city tonight. The planned departure time coincided exactly with the scheduled conclusion of the Stanford Technologies Corporate Anniversary Gala. The horrifying scope of his master plan suddenly crystallized perfectly in my mind. Blake had meticulously orchestrated the lavish corporate gala as his ultimate misdirection. He intended to stand in front of his wealthy investors, his loyal employees, and the local press, projecting the flawless image of a highly successful visionary tech executive. He would shake hands, smile for the cameras, and drink expensive champagne. Then, while the party was still raging and everyone was thoroughly distracted, he would slip out the back doors, board the waiting private jet, and vanish permanently to the Cayman Islands. He was going to disappear and live like absolute royalty on the stolen millions sitting safely in the offshore trust of his mother. And he was going to leave his terrified wife behind to take the absolute full force of the inevitable federal fallout. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation inevitably stormed the Stanford Technologies headquarters on Monday morning, they would find the primary accounts completely drained and the toxic subsidiary completely saturated with fraudulent debt. The only legal signature on every single piece of that toxic debt belonged to Alicia. Blake was intentionally abandoning her to face decades in a federal penitentiary entirely alone. He was actively framing his own wife to take the fall for his massive embezzlement. The cold, calculated rage that had been simmering inside my chest instantly forged into a weapon of absolute destruction. I looked up at the framed silver photograph of my late wife Sylvia resting on the wooden mantel. I remembered her exhausted, failing heartbeat. I remembered the con artist who had stolen our savings and forced her into an early grave. I remembered my solemn, unbreakable vow to protect our daughter from the predatory greed of ruthless men at all costs. I gripped the encrypted phone tightly and told Miranda that Blake Stanford had severely miscalculated the global reach of the man he was currently trying to rob. Apex Holdings was not just a domestic corporate entity restricted by local jurisdictions. We controlled a massive, deeply entrenched international financial network with profound influence over the global banking sector. I invoked my supreme executive authority without a single second of hesitation. I commanded Miranda to bypass all standard banking protocols and immediately contact our highest-level international banking partners operating in the Caribbean. I ordered her to leverage the full terrifying weight of Apex Holdings to execute an absolute unilateral freeze on the Cayman Islands Trust. I instructed her to flag the offshore accounts for massive international money laundering and severe corporate fraud. The foreign banks would lock the funds down instantly and aggressively to protect their own legal liability. Cynthia and her secret treasure chest was now a completely inaccessible concrete vault. His permanent escape fund was completely vaporized in an instant. He was going to step off that private jet, expecting to walk into a life of stolen luxury, only to find himself entirely penniless and actively hunted by international authorities. But I was not going to simply let him run away. I needed to look him directly in his arrogant eyes when his entire world collapsed around him. I told Miranda to finalize the audit reports and print the undeniable proof of his embezzlement. I instructed her to prepare the legal termination documents for the emergency board meeting. I ended the call and stared at the broken glass on my floor. Blake had invited the entire city to a glamorous corporate celebration tonight. He wanted a grand audience for his final performance. I decided it was time to put on my best suit and attend the anniversary gala. I was going to give him the exact devastating finale he deserved, ensuring his pathetic reign of terror was permanently extinguished and destroyed in front of everyone. The pristine silence of the executive suite felt entirely different now. It was no longer the silence of isolated power, but the deafening quiet of a sealed tomb. Blake Stanford stood frozen by the floor-to-ceiling window. He stared at the city skyline, clutching his personal cell phone with a grip so tight his knuckles ached. He had just finished throwing his frantic parents at Emmanuel, hoping their physical intimidation would secure the cash he needed to survive the afternoon. He was trying to slow his erratic breathing when the encrypted messaging application on his phone emitted a sharp, highly distinct chime. It was a priority alert notification from the offshore financial institution in the Cayman Islands. Blake swiped the screen with trembling, slick fingers. The automated text was brief, clinical, and completely devastating. The international trust registered to Cynthia Stanford had been placed under an immediate, indefinite global regulatory freeze. The message cited severe corporate fraud and international money laundering protocols. All assets were locked. All wire transfers were permanently suspended. The offshore accounts were completely inaccessible. The expensive phone slipped from his sweating hand and clattered heavily onto the hardwood floor. The screen cracked diagonally, perfectly mirroring the sudden violent fracture of his entire reality. His escape route was completely vaporized. The multi-million-dollar safety net he had spent 6 months meticulously building through theft and deceit was gone. He was not going to board a private jet tonight. He was not going to disappear into a life of stolen Caribbean luxury. He was trapped in the city with millions of dollars in violent underground gambling debts and absolutely zero capital to pay them. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. Complete and total psychological collapse descended upon him like a crushing physical weight. The walls of his expansive office suddenly felt as though they were rushing inward, squeezing the oxygen directly out of his lungs. Deep, consuming paranoia hijacked his nervous system. If the foreign banks had frozen the trust under money laundering protocols, the federal authorities were already involved. He convinced himself that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was actively monitoring his communications. He imagined unmarked tactical vans pulling up to the ground floor of the Stanford Technologies building at this exact second. He spun around, his eyes wild and hunted, scanning the immaculate office for physical liabilities. The digital trail was locked behind the server migration, but his private filing cabinet still held the raw, handwritten ledgers he had used to initially map out the embezzlement routing numbers. He lunged across the room and ripped the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk completely off its metal tracks. He gathered massive handfuls of thick paper files and practically threw himself at the industrial paper shredder sitting in the corner of the room. He jammed the documents into the feed slot. The machine whined loudly as it chewed through the dense stacks of paper. He fed file after file into the grinding metal teeth, ignoring the acrid smell of the overheating motor. The heavy oak door to his executive suite swung open. Blake violently flinched, spinning around with wild, dilated eyes. Two senior accountants stood in the doorway. They were older, fiercely loyal men who had managed the legitimate operational books of Stanford Technologies for years. They held digital tablets, their faces etched with genuine professional concern regarding the sudden, unannounced server migration that had locked them out of their daily tasks. They had come to ask their chief executive officer for guidance. Blake did not see loyal employees. His fractured, hyper-paranoid mind saw active liabilities. He saw potential federal witnesses who had intimately handled the company's financial architecture. He convinced himself they were wearing hidden recording devices. He believed they had already spoken to federal agents and were entering his office to extract a verbal confession. Blake marched toward them with an expression of pure, unhinged malice. He did not let them speak a single word. He pointed a shaking finger directly at their faces and screamed with explosive, terrifying volume. He accused them of gross corporate incompetence and corporate espionage. He shouted that they were actively conspiring against him to ruin the company. The two accountants stepped backward into the hallway, completely paralyzed by the sudden psychotic outburst. Blake fired them both on the absolute spot. He ordered them to leave their security badges on the floor and exit the building immediately without returning to their desks. He threatened to call the building security team and have them physically thrown out onto the pavement if they hesitated for a single second. The men dropped their badges and quickly retreated down the corridor, fleeing the deranged executive. Blake slammed the heavy oak door shut and locked the deadbolt. He was severing every single tie. He was burning his own empire to the ground in a desperate bid for survival. He had to leave. He could not remain in the building waiting for the federal agents to kick his door down. He grabbed his suit jacket from the leather chair and sprinted to the private executive elevator. He bypassed the main lobby, entirely descending directly into the underground parking garage. He threw himself into the driver's seat of his secondary vehicle and sped out into the blinding daylight. He drove recklessly through the city traffic, running red lights and swerving violently between lanes. His mind was a chaotic storm of terror and shifting blame. He refused to accept responsibility for the collapsing scheme. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to absorb his intense, suffocating panic. He pulled into the circular driveway of his sprawling estate, the tires screeching loudly against the pristine paving stones. He burst through the mahogany front door, his chest heaving with exertion. Alicia was standing in the grand foyer holding a small leather travel bag. She had played her part flawlessly, waiting exactly where I had instructed her to wait. Blake stormed toward her, his face twisted into a mask of cruel, projecting rage. He violently knocked the travel bag out of her hands, sending her clothes scattering across the polished marble floor. He screamed directly into her face, his vocal cords straining. He blamed her for his immense stress. He shouted that she was moving entirely too slowly, accusing her of being a useless, incompetent burden who was actively sabotaging their emergency travel plans. He yelled that a supportive wife would have packed the entire house hours ago. He hurled vicious, degrading insults at her, releasing the entire pressurized reservoir of his terror directly onto her shoulders. Alicia stepped back against the wall, keeping her eyes downcast, perfectly projecting the image of a broken, submissive victim. Her absolute silence only fueled his aggressive tirade. Blake paced the length of the foyer, running his hands roughly over his face. The adrenaline crash hit him suddenly, leaving him shaking and drenched in a cold, foul-smelling sweat. He declared that he needed a hot shower to wash off the absolute incompetence surrounding him. He ordered Alicia to clean up the mess he had just made and to have his bags packed and waiting by the door in exactly 10 minutes. He ripped his tailored suit jacket off his shoulders and threw it carelessly onto the marble floor. He stomped up the grand curved staircase, muttering dark threats under his breath. A few moments later, the heavy sound of rushing water echoed from the master bathroom suite above. Alicia waited until the bathroom door locked. She dropped the facade of the terrified wife instantly. Her posture straightened and her eyes hardened with cold, calculated precision. She knelt onto the marble floor and began gathering the scattered clothing. She reached for the discarded suit jacket Blake had thrown in his temper tantrum. As she lifted the heavy fabric, a dense, solid object slid out of the interior breast pocket. It hit the polished marble floor with a loud, sharp clatter. Alicia stared at the object resting near her knee. It was not his primary sleek corporate smartphone. It was a thick, generic, prepaid burner phone. It was the exact type of untraceable device a man uses to communicate with offshore accounts and violent underground syndicates. Alicia reached down and picked up the heavy plastic device. The screen was completely blank. She held her breath, listening to the steady drone of the shower running upstairs. She pressed her thumb firmly against the power button. The screen glowed to life, illuminating her focused face in the dim hallway, waiting for the digital secrets to finally reveal themselves. The bright glare of the generic prepaid smartphone cut through the dim shadows of the expansive marble hallway. Alicia knelt on the cold stone, holding the cheap plastic device with hands that had suddenly stopped trembling. The operating system booted up with agonizing slowness. She anticipated a complex passcode or a biometric lock, but Blake was far too arrogant to implement basic security measures on a device he believed was completely invisible. The home screen materialized, displaying a clutter-free interface with only a single active application. It was an encrypted messaging service. She tapped the icon with her index finger, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The steady, heavy drumming of the shower water echoed from the second floor, providing a consistent acoustic cover for her investigation. The application opened directly into an active chat log. There was no saved contact name, only an out-of-state area code. Alicia scrolled to the very top of the recent message history. The initial texts were visceral and highly explicit. They detailed a passionate, ongoing physical affair with a woman named Victoria. The graphic descriptions of their clandestine hotel meetings and weekend getaways turned Alicia's stomach into a tight, sickening knot. She read promises of eternal love and vicious mocking complaints about his restrictive, boring marriage. The profound humiliation of his infidelity was merely the opening act. The true devastation lay hidden within the logistical updates exchanged over the past 48 hours. Alicia continued scrolling down, her eyes scanning the blocks of gray and blue text. The conversation seamlessly transitioned from romantic promises into cold, calculated financial conspiracy. Blake actively boasted about the absolute brilliance of his master stroke. He detailed the exact structure of the Cayman Islands Trust Fund registered under his mother's name. He explained how he had successfully drained the primary corporate accounts of Stanford Technologies without triggering a single internal alarm. Then Alicia found the final fatal message. It had been sent less than an hour ago, right before Blake had suffered his screaming paranoid breakdown in the foyer. The text read with brutal, undeniable clarity. He instructed Victoria to proceed directly to the private airstrip and wait by the chartered jet. He explicitly stated that he had successfully manipulated his naive wife into signing the joint liability contracts for the toxic subsidiary. He assured his mistress that when the federal authorities inevitably raided the corporate headquarters on Monday morning, Alicia would be the only legal entity left holding the fraudulent debt. He promised he would board the jet immediately after the corporate anniversary gala tonight, abandoning his wife to absorb the entire federal indictment and face decades in prison alone. The heavy, suffocating fear that had dictated Alicia's entire existence for the past 6 months instantly evaporated. It was entirely replaced by a pure, crystallized, and profoundly lethal rage. Her father had been absolutely right. Emmanuel had warned her about the predatory nature of the Stanford family. He had told her that Blake saw her not as a partner, but as a disposable asset. She had foolishly defended her husband, clinging to the desperate illusion of a loving marriage. The glowing screen in her hand provided the undeniable objective proof of her own dangerous naivety. Blake was not a stressed executive trying to save their life together. He was a sociopathic parasite actively building a cage to destroy her. The shower water upstairs suddenly shut off. The abrupt silence signaled the end of her narrow window of opportunity. Alicia did not panic. She did not scream or confront the monster drying off in the master suite. Confrontation was a tactic for the weak and the unprepared. She needed to strike with definitive, overwhelming force. She placed the burner phone flat on the marble tile. She retrieved her own sleek smartphone from her pocket and opened the high-resolution camera. Moving with absolute mechanical precision, she photographed every single message in the chat log. She captured the explicit affair, the financial confessions, the flight itineraries, and the undeniable proof of his conspiracy to frame her for federal corporate fraud. She verified the clarity of each digital photograph, ensuring the timestamps and the area code were perfectly visible. She created an immutable digital archive of his impending destruction. She then powered down the burner phone and slipped it directly back into the interior breast pocket of his discarded suit jacket, leaving it exactly where it had fallen. She stood up from the marble floor, her posture radiating a new, dangerous authority. She completely ignored the scattered clothing she had been ordered to clean. Instead, she walked silently into the adjoining guest bedroom. She pulled a single, dark canvas duffel bag from the closet shelf. She did not pack any designer dresses or expensive jewelry. She packed only her identification documents, her passport, a secure laptop, and a few basic essentials. She zipped the heavy bag shut and slung it over her shoulder. She listened to the heavy thud of Blake's footsteps moving across the upstairs floorboards. He was searching for fresh clothes. He would expect to find her cowering in the foyer, waiting for his next barrage of verbal abuse. Alicia walked quietly through the expansive designer kitchen and unlocked the rear patio door. She slipped out into the humid afternoon air, leaving the mahogany door standing wide open behind her. She crossed the manicured backyard and bypassed the main driveway, utilizing the secondary service gate to access the private alleyway. Her hybrid sedan was parked out of sight from the road. She threw the duffel bag into the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel. She started the silent engine and drove away from the luxurious Stanford estate without looking in the rearview mirror a single time. Her former life was officially dead. She navigated the city traffic with cold, unyielding focus. She did not drive to a police station or a local attorney. She drove straight into the heart of the financial district, heading directly for the towering glass monolith of Apex Holdings. She entirely bypassed the public parking structure and carefully navigated to the highly restricted underground executive garage. The heavy steel security gates recognized her vehicle profile and opened immediately. She parked in a reserved space and grabbed her heavy duffel bag. She walked briskly to the reinforced private elevator bank. The biometric scanner instantly verified her identity and granted her access to the lowest, most secure sublevels of the corporate fortress. The heavy steel elevator doors slid open to reveal the expansive underground executive suite. Emmanuel sat behind a massive steel desk studying a wall of digital monitors tracking global market fluctuations. Miranda Yates stood rigidly by his side. Alicia walked across the room and placed her smartphone directly onto the cold steel desk. She looked at her father with eyes completely devoid of mercy. She informed him that Blake had finalized the flight logistics and intended to use the evening gala as a smokescreen to abandon her to the federal authorities. Emmanuel looked at the photographic evidence of the betrayal. He nodded once, a slow, grim acknowledgement of the impending warfare. The final execution strategy against the Stanford family was now permanently locked in. The morning sun broke over the jagged skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor of Blake Stanford's luxury penthouse condo. Friday had finally arrived. Today was the corporate anniversary gala and the day of the scheduled emergency board meeting. Blake stood in front of his full-length mirror, breathing in a slow rhythm to suppress his lingering paranoia. Yesterday was a descent into absolute terror. The freezing of the Cayman Trust and the shredding of his ledgers nearly broke his fragile mind. Yet, standing in the harsh morning light, arrogant confidence seeped back into his veins. He convinced himself he had contained the fallout. He believed the shredded papers eliminated any physical tie to the embezzlement. His ultimate shield, however, was the thick stack of joint liability contracts resting on his desk. He had manipulated Alicia into signing those toxic documents. Her forged signatures transferred the entirety of the subsidiary's financial debt onto her shoulders. Blake ran a comb through his perfectly styled hair, rewriting reality to suit his survival. He assumed Alicia was cowering in their estate, completely unaware of the federal anvil dangling over her head. He believed the impending corporate audit would inevitably strike her, crushing her beneath decades of prison time, leaving him entirely untouched. Blake turned toward his walk-in closet and selected a navy bespoke suit. He slid into the tailored jacket, adjusting the lapels with cold precision. He chose a crimson silk tie, knotting it tightly at his throat to project an image of absolute corporate dominance. He needed to look like a visionary leader today. He needed to smile at investors, shake hands with the press, and drink expensive champagne at the gala, while his wife unknowingly absorbed his criminal liability. He secured a gold tie clip and slipped a matching watch onto his wrist. He looked at his reflection one final time, completely blind to his impending destruction. He grabbed his leather briefcase and walked out the door, ready to execute his treacherous escape. Across the city, the atmosphere inside my suburban home was entirely different. The peeling wallpaper and scuffed linoleum floors had served their purpose perfectly. They provided the ultimate camouflage, allowing the Stanford family to reveal their predatory nature without restraint. The grease-stained mechanic persona had drawn out their profound arrogance and lethal greed. It was time to permanently shed the disguise. I walked down the narrow hallway and entered the master bedroom. I bypassed the standard particle board dresser and approached the heavy, dust-covered cedar closet built into the far wall. I had not opened these thick wooden doors since the day Sylvia passed away. I reached into my pocket, retrieved a small brass key, and unlocked the heavy metal deadbolt. The hinges groaned softly as I pulled the doors wide open. Inside hung the pristine, meticulously preserved armor of my actual existence. The scent of cedar and expensive fabric filled the small room. I reached past the flannel work shirts and faded denim jeans I had worn for the past 3 years. I pulled out a custom-tailored charcoal gray Italian suit crafted from the absolute finest spun wool. I laid the garments across the bed with deliberate, practiced movements. I removed my heavy work boots and dressed in complete silence. The expensive trousers fit with absolute perfection. I buttoned a crisp, stark white dress shirt and fastened a slate gray silk tie against my stiff collar. I secured my cuffs with heavy, brushed platinum links. I turned to the small velvet box resting on the top shelf of the cedar closet. I opened the lid to reveal a flawless platinum Patek Philippe watch. Its intricate mechanical face represented a level of immense generational wealth that Gregory and Blake Stanford could barely even comprehend. I strapped the heavy timepiece onto my left wrist. The cold metal against my skin felt like an old familiar friend returning from a long journey. I stepped in front of the full-length bedroom mirror. The exhausted, defeated blue-collar laborer had completely vanished into the ether. The supreme executive of Apex Holdings stared back at me. My posture naturally straightened, aligning with the immense invisible weight of global corporate authority. The time for passive observation was over. The time for silent endurance was finished. I was no longer the helpless prey. I was the absolute apex predator, and the steel trap I had meticulously built around Blake Stanford was finally ready to snap shut. I adjusted my tailored suit jacket and walked down the hallway, my leather dress shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I stepped out onto the front porch and locked the flimsy wooden door behind me for the final time. The humid air clung to the neighborhood as I walked down the concrete driveway. Exactly on schedule, a gleaming black Bentley glided smoothly around the street corner. The massive luxury vehicle hummed with suppressed power, its tinted windows obscuring the interior. It halted at the curb, its tires resting inches from the muddy tracks Gregory Stanford had carved into my lawn 24 hours earlier. The window lowered to reveal Miranda Yates sitting behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel. She wore a sharp black corporate blazer, her eyes fixed forward with lethal robotic focus. She did not offer a polite morning greeting. She simply reached over the console and unlocked the heavy rear passenger door. I opened the door and slid onto the pristine white leather seats. Alicia sat quietly in the opposite corner of the expansive luxury cabin. The terrified wife who had cowered inside the Stanford estate was entirely gone. Her posture was rigid, her spine straight against the soft leather upholstery. Her eyes burned with a cold, crystallized rage that perfectly mirrored my own silent fury. The discoveries embedded within Blake's burner phone had completely shattered her illusions, forging her grief into an unbreakable weapon. She held a thick, heavy leather folder resting securely on her lap. She looked directly over at me, her face a mask of pure, absolute resolve. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the dark leather cover. She stated the folder contained the finalized, uncontested divorce papers drafted by my legal team overnight. But more importantly, she confirmed it held the undeniable digital archive of Blake's embezzlement proofs. She had successfully downloaded and printed every single explicit text, every hidden flight itinerary, and every single financial confession he had sent to his mistress. We possessed the exact ammunition required to destroy his entire life. I nodded in silent approval. I turned my attention to the front seat and then instructed Miranda to drive directly to the glass skyscraper of Stanford Technologies. The massive, towering structure was technically the headquarters of Blake's collapsing empire, but it was legally owned by the ground beneath my feet. Miranda shifted the heavy luxury car into gear. The Bentley accelerated smoothly away from the quiet suburban street, carrying us directly toward the corporate battlefield. Blake was currently putting on his best performance, completely unaware that his ultimate reckoning was accelerating through the morning traffic. We rode in total uncompromising silence, now entirely ready to sever the head of the snake and watch the Stanford legacy bleed out onto the boardroom floor. The Stanford Technologies boardroom was a masterclass in aggressive corporate intimidation. A massive table carved from a single slab of imported black walnut dominated the center of the expansive space. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the bustling financial district below, positioning the occupants as untouchable masters of the universe. 15 senior investors sat in plush leather chairs around the perimeter of the polished wood. They were wealthy, impatient men and women who demanded absolute perfection and aggressive quarterly returns. Blake Stanford stood at the head of the table, perfectly illuminated by the modern recessed lighting above. He was delivering the performance of his entire life. The bespoke navy suit draped flawlessly over his shoulders, completely hiding the cold, foul-smelling sweat that had soaked his skin just hours prior. He moved with the smooth, practiced grace of a seasoned apex predator, projecting an aura of total, unshakable confidence. He clicked a small remote in his right hand, changing the high-resolution slides displayed on the massive digital screen behind him. The charts and graphs were meticulously fabricated, designed by his former accountants, before he had unjustly fired them in his paranoid rage to eliminate any potential federal witnesses. The numbers painted a dire picture of sudden, unexpected financial hemorrhage, but Blake masterfully controlled the narrative flow. He spoke in a deep, soothing baritone, expertly guiding the furious investors away from the truth of his massive offshore embezzlement. He expressed deep, manufactured sorrow as he explained the catastrophic capital drain. He did not stutter or hesitate as he initiated the final, most crucial phase of his survival strategy. He looked directly into the eyes of his most aggressive shareholders and placed the absolute full weight of the financial disaster directly onto the subsidiary management team without showing any remorse. Blake explicitly named the project management division, officially overseen by his wife Alicia. He shook his head with feigned, tragic disappointment. He claimed that severe gross negligence and unauthorized, highly reckless speculative investments within her specific department had triggered the massive liquidity crisis. He lied with breathtaking fluidity, assuring the board that he had only just uncovered the depth of her catastrophic financial mismanagement. He promised them that he was taking swift, decisive action to completely sever the toxic subsidiary from the primary corporate structure to protect their core assets from being entirely, completely wiped out by her egregious errors. The investors murmured in agreement, their initial anger slowly transforming into grim approval of his strong executive leadership. They believed every single poisonous word falling from his mouth. They had absolutely no idea that Blake was holding a one-way ticket to the Caribbean, or that the offshore trust holding their stolen millions had already been frozen solid by my international banking partners. Blake smiled a tight, professional smile. He felt the heavy tension in his chest begin to fully dissolve. He genuinely believed he had successfully navigated the impossible minefield. He thought he had successfully isolated Alicia as the sole, ultimate, sacrificial lamb for the impending federal audit. He turned to the digital screen to display the forged joint liability contracts, the final proof of her absolute legal culpability. He opened his mouth to deliver the final devastating blow to his wife's reputation. The heavy solid oak doors of the executive boardroom did not just open gently. They swung inward with a sudden violent force that completely shattered the quiet, controlled atmosphere of the corporate presentation. The heavy brass handles slammed aggressively against the interior glass walls, causing the thick panes to rattle ominously within their sleek metal security frames. The 15 senior investors jumped in their leather chairs, twisting around to stare at the entrance in absolute shock. Blake stopped dead in his tracks. The slick, rehearsed words completely died in his throat. He lowered his digital remote, his perfect corporate mask slipping to reveal a flash of raw, unfiltered panic. Miranda Yates walked through the shattered threshold first. She moved with the lethal mechanical precision of a guided missile. She wore a tailored black blazer, her posture rigid, and her eyes scanning the expansive room with cold, calculating authority. She did not look at the wealthy investors. She did not look at the expensive digital displays. She locked her dead predatory gaze entirely on Blake Stanford. She stepped silently to the side, formally clearing the path for the true architect of the impending destruction. I walked slowly through the open oak doors. The transformation was absolute and completely undeniable. The grease-stained boots and faded denim of the helpless working-class mechanic had been permanently incinerated. I wore the charcoal gray Italian suit with the comfortable natural authority of a man who owned the very ground beneath the skyscraper. The slate gray silk tie was perfectly immaculately knotted. The platinum Patek Philippe watch rested heavily on my left wrist, a silent, glaring testament to a level of global financial supremacy that made Stanford Technologies look like a pathetic child's lemonade stand. Alicia stepped into the boardroom right behind me, her spine straight and her chin held high. She gripped the thick leather folder containing his imminent demise tightly against her chest. She stared at the man who had actively plotted to send her to federal prison with eyes devoid of any lingering affection or mercy. We stood shoulder to shoulder at the foot of the massive walnut table, a united front of absolute, uncompromising vengeance. The heavy silence in the room stretched out thick and suffocating. The investors stared at the three uninvited intruders in total bewilderment. Blake gripped the edge of the walnut table. His knuckles turned stark white. The cognitive dissonance warring inside his fractured mind was painfully visible. He recognized my face instantly. He recognized the man he believed was a pathetic, impoverished blue-collar laborer begging for scraps. But his brain could not reconcile that ingrained, arrogant assumption with the terrifying, undeniable reality of the ruthless corporate titan currently standing in his restricted boardroom. He refused to accept the visual evidence. His deep paranoia, temporarily suppressed by his arrogant presentation, surged back to the surface with violent intensity. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my chest. He completely abandoned his smooth, professional demeanor. His voice cracked, rising into a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed painfully off the glass windows. He furiously ordered the building security personnel to enter the room and physically remove me. He screamed that I was a delusional old man who had completely lost his mind. He shouted at the bewildered investors, frantically claiming that I was a deranged, lower-class lunatic trying to extort his powerful family. He slammed his fist against the table, demanding to know how a filthy mechanic had bypassed the security checkpoints to breach a highly restricted classified executive meeting. His entire reality was fracturing into a million jagged pieces right before his very eyes. The man he thought he could crush was standing before him as an untouchable titan. The wife he thought he could discard was holding the absolute, irrefutable proof of his massive international crimes. The final curtain had officially risen, and there was absolutely nowhere left for Blake Stanford to hide from the devastating, unavoidable consequences. Blake Stanford's hysterical screaming bounced off the thick glass windows of the executive boardroom and slowly died in the heavy, tense air. I did not dignify his unhinged outburst with a single syllable of response. I simply kept my eyes fixed forward, projecting the absolute authority of a man who held the entire room in the palm of his hand. I walked past the frozen, bewildered investors with slow, deliberate strides. My leather shoes struck the polished hardwood floor with rhythmic finality. The senior shareholders shrank back slightly in their plush chairs as I passed. They recognized power. They could read the impeccable cut of my Italian suit, the heavy platinum links at my wrists, and the unyielding confidence radiating from my posture. They knew instantly that the sweating man at the front of the room was completely outmatched. Blake continued to shout his desperate demands for building security, but his voice was rapidly losing its volume. His throat tightened as his brain struggled to process my total lack of fear. I reached the head of the massive black walnut table. I stood directly in his personal space. I was taller, broader, and infinitely more grounded. He stumbled backward, his shoulder blades hitting the digital presentation screen. His chest heaved with ragged, panicked breaths. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, resembling a cornered rat, realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. Miranda Yates stepped forward, positioning herself perfectly at my right side. She did not raise her voice. Her clinical metallic tone carried effortlessly across the silent expanse of the boardroom. She addressed the 15 senior investors directly. She advised them to immediately disregard the entirely fabricated presentation they had just witnessed. She formally introduced me to the room. She stated clearly and unequivocally that my name was Emmanuel Palmer. She announced that I was the founding chairman and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. She then delivered the fatal, undeniable truth. She informed the stunned board members that Apex Holdings had covertly acquired the controlling majority shares of Stanford Technologies 6 months ago. She stated that I was the absolute undisputed owner of the corporation, the building, and every single asset associated with the brand. The small, expensive digital laser pointer slipped from Blake's slick, trembling fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp clatter that echoed like a gunshot in the dead silence of the room. His knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the edge of the walnut table to prevent himself from collapsing completely. The blood rushed entirely from his face, leaving a sickly gray mask of absolute horror. The investors gasped collectively. Several of the older shareholders exchanged rapid, panicked glances. They understood the terrifying magnitude of the name Apex Holdings. They knew my corporate reputation. They knew I was a phantom titan who devoured failing companies and eliminated corrupt executives with ruthless efficiency. The dynamic of the room shifted instantaneously. Blake Stanford was no longer the visionary tech leader. He was an exposed fraud standing on my property. Alicia stepped forward, moving with a quiet, lethal grace. She did not look at her husband. She handed me the thick, heavy leather folder she had carried from the underground garage. I took the folder and placed it gently onto the dark wood. I opened the cover. I extracted the first stack of high-resolution financial documents. I slid the glossy pages smoothly down the length of the massive mahogany table. The papers fanned out perfectly, coming to rest directly in front of the lead investors. I spoke for the first time. My voice was low, gravelly, and saturated with quiet menace. I instructed the board to examine the authentic, unredacted corporate ledgers. I explained that the pages they were looking at detailed the systematic, unauthorized transfer of over $40 million from their primary operating accounts. I reached into the folder and extracted a second stack of documents. I pushed them forcefully down the table. I announced that these pages contained the offshore routing numbers and the encrypted deposit verifications. I explicitly told the shareholders that Blake Stanford had funneled their invested capital directly into a hidden trust fund located in the Cayman Islands. I watched the investors scramble to grab the papers, their faces twisting with genuine outrage as they read the undeniable proof of his massive theft. I then pulled out the final, most damning piece of evidence. I slid the Cayman Islands banking alerts and the corresponding subsidiary contracts toward the center of the table. I stated that the offshore trust holding their stolen money was registered entirely under the name of Cynthia Stanford. I informed them that the foreign accounts had been permanently frozen by international authorities less than an hour ago. I turned my cold, predatory gaze back to Blake. He was hyperventilating, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. I verbally dissected his entire pathetic existence in front of the people he had tried to impress. I systematically tore apart every single lie, every stolen dollar, and every vile manipulation. I told the room about his massive, violent underground gambling debts. I exposed his desperate attempt to leverage his own parents into extorting a working-class mechanic for real estate equity. I pointed directly at the forged subsidiary contracts resting on the table. I explained how Blake had intentionally faked Alicia's signature, intending to leave his own wife buried under the crushing weight of his federal corporate fraud. I did not stop there. I reached into my suit pocket and retrieved the printed transcripts of his encrypted burner phone. I read his explicit, incriminating messages out loud to the silent room. I detailed his secret chartered flight scheduled to depart from an isolated airstrip tonight. I exposed his grand, cowardly plan to slip out of the anniversary gala, abandon his family, and flee to the Caribbean to join his mistress. I laid his entire rotting soul bare under the bright fluorescent lights. The investors stared at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. He was completely stripped of his bespoke armor, exposed as a pathetic, thieving coward who lacked the spine to face his own manufactured disasters. Blake could no longer support his own weight. His legs gave out completely. He dropped heavily to his knees right there on the polished hardwood floor. The pristine fabric of his expensive navy trousers pooled around his ankles. He clasped his trembling hands together in front of his chest. He looked up at me, tears of pure, unfiltered terror streaming down his pale cheeks. He began to sob loudly, a pathetic broken sound that disgusted everyone in the room. He begged me for mercy. He pleaded for a family resolution. He cried out that we could handle this privately without involving the federal authorities. He promised to sign over everything he owned if I would just let him walk away. He used the word family as if it held any value to a man like him. I merely looked down at him with the cold eyes of an apex predator. He had made his choices, and now his meticulously crafted world was burning. I signaled Miranda to open the doors. Miranda pulled the heavy brass handles inward, throwing the towering oak doors wide open to the polished corridor. The timing was perfectly synchronized. Sharp, rhythmic footsteps echoed from the marble hallway outside. Gregory and Cynthia Stanford marched into the boardroom with the entitled swagger of conquering monarchs. They had been bailed out of the county holding facility mere hours ago, utilizing emergency funds and aggressive legal maneuvering. Blake had explicitly invited them to this location to celebrate what was supposed to be a flawless corporate victory. They walked through the threshold, expecting to find a room full of subservient investors applauding their son. Cynthia wore a tailored crimson dress, her neck draped in heavy pearls, her posture radiating venomous high society arrogance. Gregory walked beside her in a sharp charcoal suit, a triumphant smirk plastered across his weathered face. He looked completely ready to uncork a bottle of vintage champagne and toast to their continued supremacy over the weak and the vulnerable. Their triumphant procession halted violently after taking exactly 3 steps into the executive suite. The arrogant smirk vanished from Gregory's face, instantly replaced by a mask of absolute bewilderment. Cynthia stopped dead in her tracks, her manicured hand flying up to cover her mouth. The scene before them completely defied human comprehension. Their golden child, the ruthless corporate titan they had raised to dominate everyone in his path, was crumpled on the hardwood floor. Blake was weeping uncontrollably. His expensive navy suit ruined, his hands clasped together in a pathetic display of absolute surrender. He was sobbing like a broken child, and he was begging for mercy at the feet of a man they recognized as a filthy, impoverished mechanic. Gregory blinked rapidly, his brain completely short-circuiting. He stared at me, standing at the head of the massive black walnut table. He saw the immaculate Italian wool, the flawless silk tie, the platinum Patek Philippe watch catching the recessed lighting, and the icy, unyielding authority radiating from my posture. The profound cognitive dissonance struck him like a physical blow directly to the chest. Gregory's shock rapidly mutated into explosive, uncontrollable rage. His face turned a deep, mottled purple. He completely ignored the 15 senior investors staring at him with unadulterated disgust. He lunged forward, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at my face. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know what kind of sick, twisted prank this was. He shouted that he would ruin me, threatening to unleash a legion of corporate lawyers to crush my entire existence. He bellowed that I was nothing but a pathetic grease monkey who had somehow conned his way into a restricted building. He commanded Blake to stand up immediately, calling him a pathetic embarrassment to the family name, demanding that his son explain why he was groveling before a worthless laborer. Blake did not stand. He simply shook his head, burying his tear-stained face in his hands, completely paralyzed by the inescapable reality of his total destruction. Blake knew the absolute truth that his parents were entirely blind to. He knew that their entire empire had been swallowed whole. I did not react to Gregory's unhinged tirade. I simply maintained direct eye contact, letting his empty, desperate threats echo against the thick glass windows. I did not flinch or raise my voice. I merely waited for the inevitable culmination of my meticulously designed trap. As Gregory continued to shout his hollow legal threats, the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps approached from the marble hallway behind them. 3 figures dressed in dark, standard-issue federal windbreakers stepped seamlessly through the open oak doors. The bright yellow letters reading FBI were printed boldly across their backs and chests. They moved with absolute, uncompromising authority, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. The lead agent, a tall man with a stern, chiseled face, flanked Gregory and Cynthia, completely cutting off their only avenue of physical escape. Gregory spun around, his mouth hanging open in mid-sentence. The angry purple flush drained from his face instantly, leaving his skin a sickly, pale white. Cynthia let out a sharp, terrified gasp, instinctively shrinking backward until her spine hit the heavy doorframe. The lead agent did not offer a polite morning greeting. He loudly announced his name and his federal division, stating unequivocally that they were executing a coordinated multi-agency raid on Stanford Technologies and all affiliated corporate entities. He declared that the building was currently locked down and no personnel were permitted to exit the premises under any circumstances. Miranda stepped forward with fluid, lethal grace. She bypassed the trembling figures of Gregory and Cynthia entirely. She walked directly up to the lead federal agent and handed him the massive compiled dossier of hard evidence. She spoke in a clear, ringing tone that carried to every single corner of the silent boardroom. She formally stated that the folder contained comprehensive, irrefutable proof of international wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and highly sophisticated money laundering networks actively orchestrated by Blake Stanford. She pointed toward the glossy financial ledgers resting on the black walnut table, confirming that the documents detailed the exact routing numbers utilized to drain $40 million from the primary investor accounts. Alicia moved to stand directly beside Miranda. She handed the lead agent a secondary file containing the localized evidence. She confirmed that the secondary folder held the digital transcripts from her husband's encrypted burner phone. She explicitly told the federal authorities that Blake had actively conspired to forge her signature on multiple toxic subsidiary contracts to frame her for the entire financial collapse. She spoke with a voice completely devoid of fear. She was delivering the final, fatal strike against the monster who had tormented her. The lead agent accepted the heavy files, his eyes scanning the detailed summaries pasted to the front covers. He nodded grimly, signaling his secondary officers to secure the perimeter of the executive suite. Cynthia Stanford began to shake violently in place. The heavy pearls rattling against her collarbone echoed loudly in the quiet room. She pointed a manicured finger directly at Alicia, letting out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She vehemently denied any involvement in her son's corporate crimes. She screamed that she was merely an innocent bystander, a highly respected member of society who had absolutely nothing to do with stolen funds. She demanded to be allowed to leave the building immediately, aggressively threatening to call the state governor. I looked directly at Cynthia, with a gaze much colder than winter ice. I raised my right hand, silencing her hysterical outburst instantly. I informed her that her political contacts could not save her from a federal indictment today. I stated clearly that the stolen millions had been meticulously routed directly into a hidden trust fund located in the Cayman Islands. I then deliberately delivered the final, inescapable truth directly to her trembling face. I told her that the offshore account holding the embezzled corporate capital was registered exclusively and entirely under her name. The frozen Cayman account permanently sealed her ultimate fate. The absolute heavy silence in the boardroom was entirely deafening. The corrupt high society family was now trapped in an inescapable legal cage forever. The piercing echoes of Cynthia Stanford's hysterical shrieks faded into a suffocating heavy silence within the expansive glass-walled boardroom. The lead federal agent gestured sharply, prompting two heavily armed tactical officers to step forward and flank the trembling matriarch, physically cutting off her erratic pacing. Gregory Stanford stood completely frozen, his tailored charcoal suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too large for his shrinking, defeated frame. The realization that his wife was officially anchored to the frozen Cayman Islands accounts paralyzed his aggressive instincts. The entire high society facade of the Stanford family had been surgically dismantled in less than 5 minutes. With the parents effectively neutralized and trapped within the federal perimeter, the room's collective focus shifted back to the center of the polished hardwood floor. Alicia stepped out from the periphery of the executive confrontation. She moved deliberately, her low heels clicking against the dark wood with rhythmic, unyielding finality. She bypassed the sprawling black walnut table and walked directly toward the ruined corporate titan weeping on the ground. Blake remained on his knees, his expensive navy bespoke suit thoroughly wrinkled and stained with the cold sweat of his total failure. His chest heaved with ragged, erratic breaths as he watched his wife approach. His fractured mind desperately sought a single remaining lifeline. He completely ignored the 15 senior investors watching his utter humiliation. He ignored the federal agents securing the exit. He looked at Alicia, his dilated eyes searching for the submissive, obedient partner he had actively manipulated for years. Blake scrambled forward across the polished floor, abandoning his manufactured corporate dignity. He lunged toward Alicia and wrapped his trembling arms tightly around her ankles. His fingers dug into the fabric of her tailored slacks. He pressed his tear-stained face against her shoes, sobbing with a pathetic, grating volume. He began to beg. His words spilled out in a frantic, chaotic torrent of desperate manipulation. He pleaded with her to remember their marriage vows. He begged her to look at the federal agents and testify that the toxic subsidiary expansion was entirely her own rogue initiative. He instructed her to lie to claim she had forged the financial documents herself to prove her corporate value. He promised her that if she simply took the fall for the embezzlement, he would utilize Stanford Technologies to secure her a minimal prison sentence. He swore he would rebuild their empire. He offered hollow promises built on the exact same lies used to construct his impending escape. Alicia stood perfectly still under the bright, recessed lighting of the boardroom. She did not flinch or pull away initially. She looked down at the man clutching her ankles. She searched her own heart for any lingering trace of affection, any microscopic fragment of the love she had once harbored for her husband. She found absolutely nothing. The reservoir of her empathy had been completely drained the moment she unlocked his encrypted messages the previous afternoon. Looking at Blake now, she did not see a powerful executive or a tragic victim of circumstance. She saw a weak, parasitic coward who was entirely willing to throw his own wife into a federal cage simply to save his own skin. Her face remained a mask of absolute chilling indifference. The raw, crystallized rage she had carried into the building consolidated into pure, unadulterated strength. She looked directly into his wild, pleading eyes. She did not raise her voice or match his hysterical energy. She spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that carried effortlessly across the silent room. She informed him that his performance was completely pathetic. She stated that he was an embarrassment to the very concept of leadership. Blake opened his mouth to launch into another frantic string of promises, but Alicia cut him off with swift physical finality. She planted her left foot firmly on the hardwood and violently kicked her right leg backward. Her heels struck his forearms with sudden focused force, breaking his desperate grip instantly. She forcibly kicked his hands away from her ankles. Blake gasped, tumbling backward onto the floor, his arms sprawling wide as he stared up at her in profound shock. Alicia reached into the dark leather folder she carried under her arm. She retrieved a dense stack of official documents bound by a heavy metal clip. The thick parchment contained the finalized, uncontested divorce papers drafted by Emmanuel's elite legal team. Resting directly on top of the legal documents was the thick, generic plastic burner phone she had extracted from his discarded suit jacket in their mansion foyer. She held the items up, ensuring the federal agents and the silent investors had a clear view of the devices of his destruction. She stepped forward and dropped the heavy bundle directly onto Blake's chest. The burner phone hit his sternum with a dull thud accompanied by the sharp slap of the legal paperwork. Blake flinched, his eyes darting from the phone to his wife's face. The sight of his secret communication device resting on top of his divorce decree completely severed his final tether to reality. Alicia delivered the killing blow. She announced to the entire boardroom that she had not spent the previous evening packing his bags or cowering in fear. She explicitly stated that she had driven straight to Apex Holdings, utilized her father's resources, and subsequently contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She looked Blake dead in the eyes and informed him that she had been working directly with the lead federal agent since late last night. She confirmed that she had voluntarily surrendered the burner phone, provided the digital archives of his explicit affair, and willingly handed over the unredacted internal communications detailing his exact strategy to frame her for the corporate collapse. She explained that the federal raid currently locking down the skyscraper was not a sudden coincidence, but the direct result of her comprehensive, finalized embezzlement proofs. The grand illusion of Blake Stanford's superiority shattered completely into dust. The devastating, inescapable reality crashed down upon his mind like a collapsing concrete wall. He realized in that exact, final, agonizing second that he had been entirely outplayed, outmaneuvered, and destroyed by the very wife he had categorized as weak and naive. Alicia had not been his convenient, disposable shield. She had been the primary, brilliant architect of his ultimate downfall. The sheer, overwhelming despair instantly seized his tightening vocal cords. He let out a raw, guttural, and pathetic scream of absolute, unmitigated defeat that violently tore through the silence of the pristine executive boardroom. The lead federal agent stepped forward, immediately terminating the confrontation. He barked a sharp command to his tactical unit. Two heavily armored officers moved in, grabbing Blake by the shoulders of his ruined bespoke suit. They hauled him violently to his feet, ignoring his thrashing legs and his continuous hysterical screaming. The cold steel of federal handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists, locking his hands firmly behind his back. The absolute apex predator had been reduced to a captive animal. The federal agents marched him toward the heavy oak doors, his cries of despair echoing loudly down the marble corridor, leaving Alicia standing victorious in the center of the conquered empire. The polished marble lobby of the Stanford Technologies skyscraper had been entirely transformed from a monument of corporate supremacy into a highly public arena of absolute humiliation. Dozens of federal tactical agents secured the perimeter, their dark uniforms forming a stark contrast against the pristine glass and steel architecture. Outside the massive revolving doors, a frantic horde of corporate journalists and aggressive paparazzi had already assembled. News of the unprecedented multi-agency raid had leaked with engineered speed. The heavy oak doors of the executive elevator bank chimed and the thick steel panels slid open. Blake Stanford emerged first. He was flanked by two burly federal officers, his hands secured tightly behind his back in cold steel handcuffs. His bespoke Navy suit, carefully selected mere hours ago to project absolute dominance, was wrinkled and stained with the sweat of his profound, undeniable failure. His perfectly styled hair fell limply across his forehead. He stared at the marble floor, completely unwilling to meet the blinding, relentless flashes of the cameras waiting just beyond the glass. Gregory and Cynthia Stanford followed closely behind their son, mirroring his captive state. Gregory's face was completely drained of its usual arrogant color, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He stumbled slightly as the federal agent guided him forward, his tailored charcoal suit entirely failing to mask his sudden crushing physical weakness. The man who had spent his entire life bullying and manipulating others for profit was now powerless, reduced to a common criminal being marched out of his own building. Cynthia walked rigidly, her eyes squeezed tightly shut against the glaring camera flashes. The heavy, expensive pearls around her neck clattered against her chest with every frantic, panicked breath. Her crimson high society dress offered absolutely no protection against the catastrophic destruction of her carefully curated public image. She was no longer a respected matriarch. She was an indicted conspirator caught in a massive international money laundering ring. The heavy glass door slid open and the overwhelming noise of the gathered press immediately engulfed them. Reporters shouted rapid-fire questions, their voices bleeding together into a chaotic, aggressive roar. They demanded statements regarding the stolen $40 million. They asked for confirmation about the frozen Cayman Islands trust funds. They yelled questions about the impending federal indictments and the complete collapse of the Stanford family empire. Blake squeezed his eyes shut and turned his head away, trying desperately to shield his face from the blinding camera flashes. He offered absolutely no comment. The federal agents pushed through the aggressive crowd with practiced, uncompromising force, forming a tight physical wedge to escort the disgraced executives toward the waiting line of unmarked tactical vehicles. The financial decimation of the Stanford family happened with staggering simultaneous speed. While Blake, Gregory, and Cynthia were being physically loaded into the back of the federal transport vans, a specialized asset forfeiture team was already executing warrants across the city. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar Stanford estate, the crown jewel of their perceived social supremacy, was immediately seized by the primary lending bank. The massive fraudulent bridge loans Gregory had secured using toxic subsidiary assets had triggered immediate catastrophic default clauses. The bank foreclosed on the property without a single second of hesitation. Federal officers arrived at the wrought iron gates, placing official seizure notices across the mahogany front doors. The luxury vehicles parked in the expansive circular driveway were impounded and towed away. The designer furniture, the expensive artwork, and every single tangible symbol of their stolen wealth were locked down under federal mandate. In the span of a single afternoon, the Stanford family was systematically and entirely stripped of their freedom, their stolen capital, and their fiercely guarded social standing. They were left with absolutely nothing. High above the chaotic scene unfolding in the plaza below, I stood silently at the floor-to-ceiling window of the executive boardroom. I watched the heavy black doors of the federal transport vans slam shut, securing the Stanford family inside. I watched the unmarked vehicles pull away from the curb, merging smoothly into the busy afternoon traffic, carrying Blake, Gregory, and Cynthia directly toward federal processing and an entirely bleak, confined future. I did not smile. I did not feel any sudden surge of triumphant glee or victorious elation. The complete destruction of their lives did not bring me joy. I felt only a profound, heavy, and absolute silence. It was the distinct, settling peace of successfully excising a deep, malignant tumor that had actively threatened the survival of my family. I turned away from the expansive glass window and looked back into the quiet boardroom. The 15 senior investors had already been quietly escorted out of the building by my own legal team, carrying the absolute truth of their salvaged capital with them. Miranda Yates stood near the heavy oak doors, efficiently coordinating the transition of the corporate infrastructure with her rapid, precise communications. The physical space that had housed Blake's arrogance and deceit was now entirely under my absolute control. Alicia remained standing by the massive black walnut table. The thick leather folder containing the finalized divorce papers and the digital embezzlement proofs rested on the polished wood. She was no longer the terrified, submissive wife who had cowered under the oppressive weight of the Stanford family. She was a hardened, resilient woman who had actively secured her own liberation. I walked across the room and stood beside my daughter. I placed a firm, reassuring hand on her shoulder. The frantic, high-stakes warfare of the past 72 hours was officially concluded. We had navigated the treacherous, manipulative labyrinth built by Blake Stanford and emerged completely victorious. The elaborate disguise of the impoverished blue-collar mechanic had served its purpose flawlessly, exposing the profound, unyielding arrogance of our enemies and providing the perfect camouflage for our counteroffensive. We had not simply reacted to their attacks. We had systematically mapped their vulnerabilities, anticipated their treacherous maneuvers, and executed a precise, overwhelming strategy that dismantled their entire existence. The Stanford family had believed they were untouchable predators hunting weak, compliant prey. They had failed to recognize the apex predator quietly observing them from the shadows, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The dust-covered cedar closet in my suburban home would remain locked. The immaculate Italian suit and the platinum Patek Philippe watch were no longer costumes. They were the undeniable, permanent reality of our restored existence. We had successfully protected our legacy, severed the toxic ties, and reclaimed our absolute sovereignty. The quiet, empty boardroom offered no applause, only the deeply satisfying stillness of absolute final justice. The setting sun bathed the modest suburban house in a warm amber glow. Emmanuel unlocked the peeling wooden door and stepped inside, followed closely by Alicia. The quiet interior felt remarkably different now. It was no longer a stage for a deceptive mechanic, but a genuine sanctuary, holding the final unspoken truths of their family history. Emmanuel removed his tailored suit jacket and draped it carefully over the back of the worn floral armchair. He loosened his silk tie and unbuttoned his collar, letting the immense weight of the corporate execution finally slide from his shoulders. Alicia walked straight into the small, linoleum-floored kitchen. She filled the battered aluminum kettle with water and set it on the stove. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock marked the passage of time as she gathered 2 ceramic mugs and a box of Earl Grey tea. She moved with a profound calmness, completely detached from the chaotic destruction they had just unleashed upon the Stanford family. She poured the steaming water into the mugs and carried them back into the living room. She handed one to her father and sat down on the edge of the frayed sofa. Emmanuel held the warm ceramic between his palms, his eyes tracing the faded pattern of the living room rug. The silence between them was comfortable, completely lacking the suffocating tension that had defined Alicia's existence for the past 3 years. She took a slow sip of her tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest. She set the mug down on the scratched wooden coffee table and looked directly at him. The lingering fundamental question finally surfaced. She asked him with quiet clarity why he had hidden the absolute magnitude of his wealth from her for her entire life. She asked why he had allowed her to believe they were struggling working-class citizens while he silently commanded a global financial empire. Emmanuel did not avoid her gaze. He leaned back in his chair, his expression softening into a deep, reflective sorrow. He began to speak about her mother, Sylvia. He described a woman of profound brilliance and uncompromising integrity. He explained that when he first launched Apex Holdings, the rapid influx of massive capital had fundamentally altered the world around them. He detailed how the immense wealth acted as a beacon, attracting an endless swarm of opportunistic parasites, manipulative sycophants, and ruthless predators disguised as friends. He and Sylvia had watched their social circle transform into a treacherous landscape of hidden agendas and calculated betrayals. They had witnessed firsthand how the gravity of a billion-dollar fortune warped relationships, corrupted morals, and entirely dismantled genuine human connection. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a quiet, serious register. He explained that when Alicia was born, Sylvia had made him swear a solemn oath. They agreed to shield their daughter from the corrosive influence of their corporate empire. Emmanuel detailed their deliberate strategy to raise Alicia in an environment entirely devoid of financial privilege. He wanted her to build her character through genuine struggle. He wanted her to cultivate her intellect and her independence without the suffocating protective shadow of a massive trust fund. He stated that he needed her to understand the absolute value of hard work, the necessity of personal resilience, and the critical importance of genuine relationships built on mutual respect rather than monetary expectation. He confessed that he had constructed the mechanic persona to guarantee she would be valued for her mind and her heart, not for the balance of his hidden bank accounts. Emmanuel closed his eyes for a brief moment, the deep lines around his mouth deepening with heavy regret. He looked back at Alicia, his voice thickening with raw, unfiltered emotion. He offered a profound and absolute apology. He confessed that his protective strategy had contained a massive, dangerous flaw. By hiding his wealth and his power, he had inadvertently made her appear vulnerable to predators who specifically targeted the weak. He admitted that his deception had allowed a sociopathic opportunist like Blake Stanford to slip through the cracks and infiltrate her life. He stated that he had watched Blake manipulate her, demean her, and attempt to systematically dismantle her confidence, and he had been forced to wait until the trap was perfectly primed before intervening. He apologized for the pain she had endured, acknowledging that his desire to protect her had ultimately placed her directly in the line of fire. Alicia listened to her father's confession in absolute silence. She processed the weight of his words, aligning the harsh reality of her recent trauma with the profound, protective love embedded within his lifelong deception. She understood the terrible logic of his decision. She had witnessed the exact parasitic greed he described manifest completely within Blake and his parents. She knew precisely how easily a massive fortune could attract monsters. She reached across the small coffee table and placed her hand firmly over his. Her grip was strong and entirely unwavering. She looked at the man who had orchestrated the flawless destruction of her enemies and offered him absolute absolution. She told him there was absolutely nothing to forgive. She stated clearly that his strategy, however painful the execution had become, had ultimately succeeded. The grueling ordeal with the Stanford family had not broken her. It had incinerated her naivety and forged her core into hardened steel. She explained that she was no longer the compliant, frightened wife desperate to please a manipulative husband. She was no longer the fragile, uncertain woman who required a protective shield. She understood the true nature of power, the necessity of ruthless calculation, and the absolute importance of defending one's legacy against predatory threats. She squeezed his hand tightly, her eyes locking onto his with cold, brilliant determination. She announced that she was entirely ready to step out of the shadows. She was ready to assume her rightful place beside him and lead the empire. The sharp, crisp sunlight of early Monday morning pierced the glass facade of the Stanford Technologies skyscraper, washing the sterile corporate lobby in brilliant, untainted gold. The atmosphere inside the towering structure had fundamentally shifted over the weekend. The oppressive, suffocating tension that had previously dictated the actions of every terrified employee was entirely gone. A new, palpable energy hummed through the marble corridors. The frantic whispers of federal raids and arrested executives had evolved into a quiet, focused determination. I bypassed the standard security checkpoints with fluid ease, stepping into the private executive elevator that shot silently toward the penthouse suite. The heavy steel doors slid open, revealing a completely transformed operational floor. Miranda Yates was already stationed at the central administrative desk, directing a synchronized team of corporate auditors with clinical precision. I walked directly down the polished hardwood hallway and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to the primary executive suite. Blake Stanford's former domain had been thoroughly and systematically purged. The gaudy, excessive displays of unearned wealth were entirely eradicated. The ridiculous modern art sculptures, the excessive crystal decanters, and the absurdly oversized imported leather couches had been hauled away by a dedicated removal team on Sunday afternoon. The massive room was now stripped down to its functional, elegant core. A single immaculate black walnut desk anchored the space, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling metropolis below. The walls were bare clean and completely devoid of the pathetic ego that had previously infected the corporation. I unbuttoned my suit jacket and took my position behind the heavy wooden desk. I was officially stepping in as the interim chief executive officer, assuming direct, unyielding command over the fractured empire. My immediate objective was absolute stabilization. I needed to cauterize the financial wounds Blake had inflicted and redirect the massive operational momentum toward genuine, sustainable growth. The heavy mahogany doors swung open again. Alicia walked into the executive suite with a powerful, commanding stride that completely erased any lingering shadow of her former vulnerability. She wore a tailored slate gray suit, her posture radiating absolute professional authority. She carried a thick, organized portfolio of restructuring blueprints directly under her arm. There was no hesitation in her movements. She bypassed the visitor seating entirely and took her rightful position at the secondary executive desk positioned perfectly adjacent to my own. I watched my daughter settle into her new reality as the official chief operating officer of the corporation. The transformation was profoundly magnificent. The frightened, compliant wife who had walked on eggshells to appease a volatile, narcissistic husband was dead and buried. The woman sitting across from me was a brilliant, hardened strategist ready to rebuild an entire corporate infrastructure from the ground up. We spent the next 4 hours dissecting the bloated, toxic subsidiary networks Blake had established to hide his embezzlement. Alicia operated with lethal financial efficiency. She identified the structural redundancies, authorized the immediate termination of corrupt middle managers, and reallocated the salvaged capital toward the essential functioning departments. She did not ask for my permission to execute her tactical maneuvers. She simply presented her optimized solutions and immediately initiated the operational protocols. I observed her brilliant, systematic dismantling of the old regime with immense, silent pride. She was applying the resilience and intellect she had cultivated during her darkest hours to conquer the highest echelons of the business world. We were no longer simply surviving a hostile environment, we were actively dominating it. By mid-afternoon, the initial wave of structural reorganization was officially completed. Alicia excused herself to personally address the senior engineering teams on the lower floors, intent on establishing a new, transparent corporate culture. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind her, leaving me completely alone in the expansive executive suite. I stood up from the black walnut desk and walked slowly toward the towering glass windows. I clasped my hands behind my back, looking out over the endless, sprawling skyline of the city. The microscopic cars navigated the concrete arteries far below. The towering steel structures caught the fading afternoon sunlight. I stood at the absolute pinnacle of the financial world, viewing the city not as a conqueror, but as a silent guardian who had successfully neutralized a catastrophic threat. The quiet click of the suite door opening broke the heavy silence. I turned around slowly. A young man barely in his early 20s stood frozen just inside the threshold. He wore the standard gray uniform of the building's maintenance staff. He was clutching a plastic cleaning bin and a spray bottle, his eyes wide with sudden, absolute terror. He had clearly expected the office to be entirely empty. He recognized me immediately as the new, undisputed owner of the corporation, the Phantom Titan who had orchestrated a federal raid and destroyed the Stanford family in a single day. He began to stammer, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. He quickly took a step backward, clutching his cleaning supplies to his chest, and nervously apologized for the unannounced intrusion. He promised to return later, clearly terrified that his simple mistake would cost him his livelihood. I did not raise my voice or scowl. I unclasped my hands and offered a warm, genuine smile. I walked across the polished hardwood floor, closing the physical distance between us. I extended my right hand directly toward him. He stared at my palm for a fractured second, completely bewildered, before hurriedly wiping his own hand on his gray uniform trousers. He reached out and accepted my handshake. His grip was calloused and rough, bearing the distinct, familiar texture of honest, unrelenting physical labor. I introduced myself simply by my first name. I asked him his name and inquired gently about how his day was progressing. I asked him if the recent corporate transition had caused any unnecessary stress for the maintenance department. The young janitor blinked multiple times in sheer, unfiltered astonishment. He hesitantly offered his full name, eagerly explaining that his morning shift was running smoothly and simultaneously expressing profound gratitude for his continued employment under the new management structure. I thanked him sincerely for his vital daily contributions to the massive facility. I explicitly assured him his position was entirely secure and strongly encouraged him to proceed with his standard duties without any further apprehension. He nodded vigorously, his initial paralyzing terror rapidly melting into a bright expression of absolute awestruck amazement. He quietly emptied the leather wastebaskets and gracefully exited the expansive suite, clearly marveling at the billionaire's completely unexpected humility. I turned back toward the sprawling city skyline, taking a slow, deep breath of the cool, conditioned air. The final inescapable realization crystallized within my mind with absolute, undeniably brilliant clarity. True power is never about utilizing immense wealth to blindly humiliate the weak or maliciously subjugate the vulnerable. True power is possessing the unyielding strength to fiercely protect the specific people you deeply love and maintaining the absolute, uncompromising ruthlessness to completely destroy anyone who actively threatens them. The sprawling corporate empire was finally safe, fully operational, and entirely secure. The necessary balance and strict order was completely restored forever. The long, silent adjustment was officially and permanently finalized. True strength does not emerge from a life of sheltered privilege or unearned comfort. It is forged in the crucible of deep adversity, vicious betrayal, and profound struggle. When we face those who actively seek to exploit our perceived weaknesses, we are presented with a definitive choice. We can either crumble under the crushing weight of their manipulation, or we can harness that immense pain to build an unbreakable core of solid steel. You must learn to stand firm aggressively, reclaim your stolen dignity, and strike back with absolute precision. Subscribe to our channel today and share your ultimate triumph.